even claim to be rational, what does it need to have? I'll throw you off the way I asked that question. Evidence. It's got to have sufficient evidence to support it. So what we've shown is that evolution can't even get started. It doesn't have a mechanism to actually change, to go anywhere. It can't get started, it can't go anywhere. So now we want to look at, well, wait a minute, what about all of these evidences for Darwinian evolution that are in the textbooks? So these young people will see in their textbooks supposed evidence for evolution, and so we're going to look at that now. And this was a summary of what we've looked at with regard to the laws of science over the last 4 sessions. The implications of these laws, anyway. This isn't exactly what the laws say, but they're implications. And so major problems for the evolutionary model. Now, if you were to ask an evolutionist, where is the proof for Darwinian evolution? You're probably going to hear a discussion of some or all of these alleged proofs of Darwinian evolution. Biology textbooks typically have several pages devoted to giving the evidence for evolutionary theory, assuming they haven't just totally cut out their evidences now. But you're probably going to have a section in there that's called Evidences for Evolution in your textbook. But in truth, as we wade through these evidences, we'll see that they all fall under one of 3 categories. They're either erroneous, that is, they've been proven to be false over the years by evolutionists themselves. They're irrelevant, that is, they don't have anything to do really with Darwinian evolution, but rather just microevolution, which we agree with. It doesn't prove macroevolution. Or they're inadequate, that is, they would support evolution, but they're not sufficient to prove it, which was more like what we looked at last night with the Big Bang, when we looked at expansion and the cosmic microwave background radiation. Those are inadequate in proving the Big Bang, and some of these evidences we'll look at are also inadequate to prove evolution. So let's wade through these evidences of evolution to see if they pass the test. Charles Darwin, in his studies, I mentioned in a previous session that he noted animals that were slightly different from one another, but still seemed to be related. And they would often be found in a single local area, but in different habitats, like different climates. And he saw this as evidence that those animals evolved from a common ancestor in the area, and therefore that they were related. And so we already looked at the primary evidences that he pointed to, like the finch, and he noted the same pattern with various tortoises and iguanas and plants. And recall that we also noted that finches that were slightly different from one another were still acknowledged to be finches, and the changes that occurred in them was due to, remember, heritable variation. So variation that was already built into the genomes of the parents, and so nothing new was being added. Macroevolution had not occurred, only microevolutionary change, which we don't have a problem with. So not proof that we came from ape-like creatures. He also admitted cases where there were animals in similar habitats across the world that were apparently not really related. There's 2 away from each other, but that had similarities in structure. And they called this convergent evolution. And so he considered this to be evidence of natural selection, that if you apply the same pressures to creatures, even if they're not related, then certain body characteristics would tend to thrive in various environments if they're similar environments, while others less suited to that environment are going to die out. Now again, this of course is just evidence of natural selection, which again doesn't prove that we evolved from a single-celled organism. We don't have a problem with natural selection, which remember acts more as a filter. It doesn't give you the new creature, it just filters out from the creatures that exist, those creatures that aren't as well suited to that environment. All right, another evidence, Ernst Haeckel is a German biologist and avid supporter of Charles Darwin in the 1800s. He popularized the theory now known as embryonic recapitulation, and he drew charts like this one, embryonic recapitulation that was called the biogenetic law. This is not biogenesis, but the biogenetic law. This is the idea that embryos, as they develop in the womb, they repeat the evolutionary development of their species. They shouldn't have called this a law because it had not been proven whatsoever. So, for instance, according to this theory, as humans are embryos developing in the womb, he argued they go through the stages of our ancestors evolutionarily. So we go through this period, he said, where we look like various animals that we supposedly evolved from, fish and so forth. And so supposedly there's a period of time where human embryos have gills represented in red on the screen, as were embryos, he says, and tails like our supposed evolutionary ancestors. And so Haeckel drew these pictures in different phases of their embryological development, put them side by side with the various species to try to bolster the case for evolution. So embryonic recapitulation is still taught in many biology classes today, using the catchphrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. The problem is this was shown to be false decades ago. The famous influential paleontologist of Columbia University, George Gaylord Simpson, and his colleague William Beck wrote, "The human embryo does not have any differentiated gill tissues, and the gill-like pouches do not have open gill slits, as in fishes. Fins are lacking. The tail is not at all like any fish's tail. Indeed, the resemblance to an adult fish is vague and superficial, right? It's just surface level. There's nothing about this that really is like a tail." So bottom line, as Simpson and Beck went on to say, it's now firmly established that ontogeny does not recapitulate phylogeny. So according to prominent evolutionists, Haeckel was wrong. Embryos don't mimic Darwinian evolution as they grow in the womb. Erich Blechschmidt was a prominent German embryologist and anatomist. The Blechschmidt Collection and Museum at the University of Göttingen was named after him. And he didn't pull any punches in his criticism of Haeckel's theory. He said the so-called basic law of biogenetics is wrong. No buts or ifs can mitigate this fact. It's not even a tiny bit correct or correct in a different form. It is totally wrong. Well, if that's the case, then what do we make of these drawings? Well, the material it displays is actually a hoax. It's actually fake. Misrepresentations, even lies. He not only altered his illustration of the embryos to fit his agenda, he even printed the same plate of an embryo 3 times and then just labeled it differently. One a human, one a dog, the third a rabbit, in order to show their similarities. Haeckel perpetuated this hoax, and even many evolution-friendly biology textbooks admit that. Miller and Levine's biology textbook, put out by Prentice Hall, very famous, very widely used textbook, says Ernst Haeckel fudged some of his drawings to make the earliest stages of some embryos seem more similar than they actually are. And sadly, in spite of these admissions, biology textbooks still use embryonic recapitulation as proof of evolution. In fact, this statement on the screen is in the section of the textbook called Evidence of Evolution. So they've kept it in there, even though they come out and say, well, really, it's not what we thought it was. Regarding Haeckel's embryos, professor of zoology at the University of Manchester, Matthew Cobb, writing in New Scientist, he said, "It's embarrassing but true. Some of the most influential drawings in the history of biology are wrong, exaggerated to fit a thesis." All right, another supposed evidence, homologous structures. What is this about? Evolutionists argue that many vertebrate species with a backbone, are constructed with a lot of the same basic bones and therefore have a lot of similarities. And because of the similarity, they argue, as does this biology textbook, homologous structures provide strong evidence that all 4-limbed vertebrates have descended with modifications from common ancestors. So is that true? So we have, if they're similar looking anatomical structures, according to evolutionists, that is strong evidence that we are related, that we share a common ancestry with whales and frogs. Well, Darwin himself saw homology as a strong point in support of evolution. He said, "We have seen that the members of the same class, independently of their habits of life, resemble each other in the general plan of their organization. Is it not powerfully suggestive of true relationship, of inheritance from a common ancestor?" So is that true? I mean, after all, aren't our similarities to our siblings and parents proof that we're related to them? Well, first of all, it's important to realize that we don't deny that there are similarities between the different creatures. We don't deny the evidence. There's no need to deny the evidence. It will always be in harmony with the truth. So the problem isn't the evidence, it's the interpretation by evolutionists of that evidence. The evolutionist says similarities prove a common ancestor. Creationists argue that commonalities prove a common designer. So when you think about the automobile industry, for example, many GMC models use the exact same wheels, brake systems, windshield wipers, light bulbs, even have similar body shapes with one another sometimes. Why is that? Well, it's because they came to life and mutated into another model, right? No, the homologous structures, their similarities exist because they were designed by the same company. They share a common designer. And keep in mind, those vehicles are designed to drive on similar roads, in freeways, to use the same gas and have the same mechanics. And so in the same way, when God designed, say, the lung to be suitable for life on earth, then one would expect a very similar design to be used in other creatures that would be living contemporaneously on the same planet in the same relative environment. If the lung is already engineered well, you would expect similarities of that to be in other creatures. This is an engineering concept. So in truth, when examined closely, the homology argument quickly starts to break down and you start to see inconsistencies. For example, humans share similar structures with many other creatures that are not argued to be relations of ours in any kind of close way. For example, we have structures that share similarities with the octopus eye, the pig heart, the Pekingese dog's face, the milk of a donkey, and the pronator quadratus muscle of the Japanese salamander. All right, but evolutionists would hardly deem these guys to be close relations to humans. Even certain plants in the crustacean Daphnia have hemoglobin, as do humans. So are they close relations of man? And also keep in mind that evolutionists admit that similar structures don't always mean common ancestry, because they believe environmental pressures, remember, can cause certain features to show up separate and apart from ancestry, right? So that idea that I talked about earlier with the convergent evolutionary idea. Another inconsistency, if similarity proves a common ancestor, then shouldn't dissimilarity prove no common ancestry? There are more dissimilarities between humans and other animals than there are similarities. So the homology argument only works when you pick and choose. In truth, it makes more sense that there was a common designer who used certain structural features several times in many creatures due to the fact that those anatomical structures are ideal for life on this planet. So the homology argument can hardly be used as evidence for evolution when structural similarities can be interpreted in other ways that make sense. So this would be an example of inadequate evidence for evolution. What about genetic similarities? Haven't scientists discovered that human DNA is like 98 to 99% identical to chimpanzee DNA? And on the surface, sounds like a pretty strong argument. I remember this argument when I was in school. This was a strong argument for the evolution of man from an ape-like creature and for our close relation. Now keep in mind, evolutionists don't argue that we evolved from apes. They argue that apes and humans evolved from the same common ancestor. There was an ape-like creature that brought about apes and brought about humans separately. Now again, when we look at this argument deeper, we find that there are major problems with this argument as well. First of all, further research into the genome has caused that number to continue to drop over the years, and I'll talk more about that later. And so this is misleading to even make this argument on their part, because first of all, X and Y chromosomes, because of our chromosomes, did you know that male humans are actually closer genetically to male chimps than we are to human females? It's really how you look at these numbers. It's how you kind of choose to phrase things. That doesn't really make male humans closer to chimps than women, although maybe we act like it sometimes. Jonathan Marks is an evolutionary anthropologist and geneticist who was a professor at Yale for several years, as well as at UC Berkeley. He's now a professor at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. And he talks extensively about the dangers of misinterpreting the genetic evidence and reading too much into these DNA similarities between chimps and humans. He wrote a book called What It Means to Be 98% Chimpanzee. And he discusses this misleading tendency to compare long chains of genetic subunits in DNA. So you keep in mind that DNA is just 4 chemicals in a sequence, A, G, C, and T, and whatever this sequence is determines who you are physically. And so, the way that you arrange that and so forth. And he says that the comparison, like when you compare these chains, you look at those sequences in A, G, C, and T between chimpanzees and humans, the comparison can also be misleading in 2 important ways. First, such comparisons of DNA sequence ignore qualitative differences, those of kind rather than amount. So you might have sequences that line up, but there's difference in the quality of the two, maybe the amount of the chemical, for example. The second misleading area of DNA sequence comparisons entails a consideration of the other end of the scale. He explains that because DNA is a linear array of those 4 bases, A, G, C, and T, only 4 possibilities exist at any specific point in a DNA sequence. The laws of chance, there's the laws of chance again, tell us that 2 random sequences from species that have no ancestry in common will match at about 1 in every 4 sites. Thus, even 2 unrelated DNA sequences will be 25% identical, not 0% identical. Understand the concept? I mean, all they're doing is comparing A, G, C, and T sequences. And at any point, even if you're not related, it's still going to say you're 25% related. All right? So very misleading even to use this argument. So using the same DNA comparisons that are used to compare chimps and humans, a daffodil is genetically 25% human. Okay? Because its DNA is still going to match humans at least 25% of the time, just because of random chance. Does that sound like an accurate comparison to you? Is a daffodil 1/4 human? No. Thank you. Now, that said, certain genetic similarities would be completely expected, given similar body structures, physiologies, biochemistries, intended diets, given that certain living organisms were designed for life in similar environments, similar habitats, and ultimately given the same designer. Humans and chimps are both mammals and have similar types of internal organs. We both eat fruits and vegetables, which means our mouths and digestive systems have some similar characteristics. We both have eyes, ears, noses, mouths, fingers, and get sensory information from these body structures. So there's no doubt that there's going to be many similarities between human and chimp DNA, but that doesn't mean that you jump from A to Z and draw unwarranted conclusions about the evidence and say we evolved from an ape-like creature. Similarities exist and should be expected if we share a common designer, and once again, that perspective is in complete harmony with the creation model. But if a person contends that genetic similarities prove a common ancestry, then you've got problems that come about from that. So keep in mind, all that said, First of all, geneticist Jeffrey Tompkins, who's a creationist, he dug into these comparisons several years ago to see what's really going on here. And one of the things he found out is that in the human-chimp DNA comparisons, the researchers were only taking the sections of the DNA that actually were similar between the two and comparing those and leaving out the sections that didn't really match at all. So when he started working all that back in, he found that it was roughly about 70 to 80% similarity. Now, interestingly, about a year ago, the secular community reassessed this and came out with a study that verified creationist studies on this. And they've now backed off of this 98 to 99% and are now arguing the same thing creationists have been arguing for years, that we're not that similar in DNA with the chimps. Creationists got there first, and once they drop their biases, then they can catch up with us. What about horse evolution? Hasn't that been documented in the fossil record? It's definitely been taught in the biology textbooks for decades. Supposedly the modern horse known as Equus has been documented as having evolved from the small fox-like creature known as Hyracotherium or Eohippus. And so one biology textbook said, in spite of the missing pieces, paleontologists can offer a relatively clear picture of the evolution of many organisms. One example is the series of fossils that shows the development of the modern horse over 50 million years. The authors then proceed to show the standard horse evolution diagram, showing the alleged evolution of the modern horse from Hyracotherium, saying the first horse was actually quite small, about the size of a small dog. This illustration shows the first horse as well as several of the intermediate ancestors of today's horse. The 2006 edition continued to promote this idea. On page 439, the authors used the standard classic pictures of horse evolution to illustrate the nature of evolution by gradualism. John Rennie, writing in Scientific American in 2002, he said, actually, paleontologists know of many detailed examples of fossils intermediate in form between various taxonomic groups. A sequence of fossils spans the evolution of modern horses from the tiny Eohippus. So they tout horse evolution charts as decisive evidence of evolution. Now the problem is that the evolutionists themselves, the ones really in the know on this, long ago backed off of this argument as an example of transitional forms. David Raup of the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago admitted decades ago, well, we're now about 120 years after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. By this, I mean that some of the classic cases of Darwinian change on the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as a result of more detailed information. What appeared to be a nice, simple progression when relatively few data were available now appears to be much more complex and much less gradualistic. So not sufficient evidence to be able to prove evolution here. It's not there. Famous paleontologist of Harvard, George Gaylord Simpson, summed up the truth years ago when he said the uniform continuous transformation of Hyracotherium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. So I wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater on this. Now this chart doesn't prove that a fox-like creature can turn into a horse, but that's not to say that paleontologists may not have gotten some of this right. We wouldn't expect modern horses to look exactly like the horses that were on the ark. Okay, there's been a lot of variety and variation and change in all species since the flood, and so it could be that one of these guys is actually was more like what the horse was that was on the ark, but it would still be the horse kind. It wouldn't be from something that is non-horse. What about whale evolution? So some of them say, well, okay, who cares about horse evolution? Because we got whale evolution. We can prove that. So one Science Daily article titled, "Whales Descended from Tiny Deer-like Creature," said, whale evolution is one of the best documented examples of mammal evolution. Here it is. Right? I mean, this proves it, guys. Just hands down. Forget all the other stuff we've covered, right? This single example is what does it. One of the best documented, right? So if you can disprove this one, what does that say about all their other evidences? So supposedly in this well-documented story, whales evolved from mammals that lived on land and that supposedly gradually moved into the water in search of food, fish and water prey, which, by the way, isn't that interesting? We supposedly evolved from creatures in the water. Yeah, you catching this? We evolved from creatures in the water, went on to land, and then creatures wanted to evolve back into the water now? I mean, this is what they have to do, with their thinking on this. In the 2000 edition of Nature magazine, in a 2000 edition, J.G.M. Thewison, who's an evolutionary anatomist out at Northwest Ohio Medical University, he claimed to have found the oldest and closest relative of the whale. Now, here's the problem. For many years in this supposedly well-documented evolution of whales, the creature that was considered to be the closest whale relative is the hippopotamus. Now, if that's right, then there's no way that whale evolution is very well documented. Because Thewison claimed the evolutionary community has got this all wrong. We need to change the entire theory about whale evolution. Supposedly, Indohyus, which is a small, stocky artiodactyl roughly the size of the raccoon, should be now considered the closest relative of the whale. This is a creature that looks like the African mouse deer. All right, now if whale evolution is so well documented, then how in the world can you make a switch like this just because you find a particular fossil, as though that's just there's no big deal? You change from the hippo as the closest ancestor to a small, stocky artiodactyl roughly the size of the raccoon? Okay, this must not be so well documented. Of course it's not. It just highlights how they work on that, how they operate. So again, supposedly in this well-documented stories, whales descend from land-living mammals that move into water in search of fish and water-dwelling prey. So again, with Thewison's find, they got to throw all this out. According to him, the mammals that gradually moved into the water in search of prey weren't carnivores at all, which is what has always been thought. Clearly, this is not the case. Indohyus is a plant eater and already is aquatic. Apparently, the dietary shift to hunting animals, as modern whales do, came later than the habitat shift to the water. Okay, so with the discovery of one deer-like fossil, they're making pretty big changes here and sweeping aside everything that they've set up to this point that's been touted as being so well documented. Whales didn't evolve from land-dwelling ancestors in search of food. Their ancestors were already in the water and were herbivores, not carnivores. Now, what in the world about this Indohyus is linking this to whales in their mind? What's so significant about this find that makes Thewison want to change the evolutionary lineage of the whale? According to scientists, although Indohyus, as it is known, looks nothing like the whales of today, it shares certain anatomical features, right? So now we're back to the homologous structures again. Oh, you see structures that are similar, then they must be related. Instead of the possibility of a common designer, it just triggers to them, oh, well, this just means they're closer to each other. It doesn't matter how crazy it seems. So even though it looks nothing like the whale, it shares certain anatomical features. Now, logically, doesn't the whale share anatomical features with other creatures that would make more sense as close relations? Don't you think? What makes the Indohyus special? Exactly. Thewison actually admits that these anatomical features are in fact shared in other creatures, as all these characters are found in some mammals unrelated to cetaceans, whales. Okay, so what's so special about Indohyus? The distinguishing feature of the Indohyus appears to be its teeth. All right, this is the main thing, which suggests they're suggested to be similar to whales' teeth. Now, the whole shift is based on this. Now, here's the problem with this. Indohyus, which is a confessed herbivore, and the teeth of whales they're carnivores. Now, they ridicule creationists when we say from Genesis 1 and Genesis 9, it indicates all creatures were originally created to be plant eaters, even the modern carnivores. And their ridicule centers on the teeth of the two types of creatures. Bill Nye scoffed at Ken Ham in the Bill Nye-Ken Ham debate over that issue. And now they want to argue that the teeth of the herbivore Indohyus is similar enough to the carnivorous teeth of whales. Well, we'd argue, hey, if you look at panda teeth, they look pretty carnivorous until you realize that they eat bamboo. All right, so what do we get out of this? Well, one thing I think we can get out of this is that notice how easily they make their changes. Their story's not documented, no matter what they say about this. The evidence isn't so solid. Well, what about the famous alleged missing link fossils outside of the hominids that we'll look at later, like Archaeopteryx? In 1861, the first specimen of Archaeopteryx was unearthed, and immediately it was jumped on as the premier example of a transitional fossil. This is supposed to be the creature bridging the gap between the reptiles, like the dinosaurs, and the birds. And it appeared to have feathers and claws on its wings and teeth, like it's in the middle of changing into birds. Well, we know that some modern birds have claws on their wings, like the African turaco and the South American hoatzin when it's young. Claws which they use to grasp branches and climb trees, so that's not evidence of any transition. Ostriches also have claws. Also, a fossil of an admitted bird was unearthed in Mongolia that had teeth, and nobody claims this is anything but a bird. Other fossils of admitted birds with teeth have been uncovered as well. So having claws or teeth on a bird doesn't mean that it's transitional. And then you have the fact that a bird was discovered in Texas in strata that are thought to be 75 million years older than the layer Archaeopteryx was found in, proving that birds had already been on the scene 75 million years before Archaeopteryx, based on their own timeline, of course. So Archaeopteryx could hardly be transitional to the birds, otherwise it should be down here. And yet it came around 75 million years later. Well, even though Archaeopteryx is still listed in many textbooks as an example of a missing link, paleontologists are generally in agreement now that it wasn't the missing link they hoped it was, possibly just a feathered dinosaur. Henry Gee, who's a British paleontologist and senior editor of Nature, said concerning the dethronement of Archaeopteryx, Archaeopteryx is just another dinosaur with feathers. This is not a missing link. What about Tiktaalik? This is another alleged transitional fossil, proclaimed to be a solid example of a transitional creature. This guy is said to be the transitional creature between the fish and the amphibians. So a creature whose front fins, his pelvic fins, are thought to have been evolving into legs. Well, there's many issues with this theory to start out with, but as of 2010, the whole theory has started being scrapped now because researchers in Poland discovered four-limbed animal tracks in strata, once again understood to be 9 million years older than the strata Tiktaalik is found in. So Tiktaalik's just starting to try to get two legs going, and yet we've already got four-limbed creatures with strong legs 9 million years before that. So if you got strongly walking four-limbed animals already in existence millions of years before the time of Tiktaalik, then again, this can't be a transitional creature between fish and the four-legged animals. It should be down here. All right, another example of evidence that you'll see. This is a big one. What about vestigial organs? So if evolution were true and human beings are the current dominating species and a long line of evolutionary changes starting with a supposed ape-like ancestor, there's some predictions we could make, scientific predictions you could make based on that. Not only would you expect the fossil record to reflect those transitions and so forth from these other creatures, you'd expect at least two other things as well. First of all, there should be human beings alive today transitioning, shouldn't we? In other words, you should be able to examine the human population and find human beings in the process of evolving into better, supposedly more fit creatures. Like maybe, huh?
Not fuzzies.
Yeah, not fuzzies, right. You know, so you might expect some knobs coming off of our shoulders as we're starting to grow wings or something. You know, you should expect we're transitioning into something. It shouldn't be that we've already got the complete package of everything out there. Things should be in the middle of growing something. Okay, so if you've got, you know, four-legged creatures, you know, maybe some of them are being born now where maybe they've only got three or just two or something. They're in the middle of switching where we're no longer going to be tetrapedal, we're going to move into bipedal now. All right, you should see these kind of transitions going on. Maybe in the middle of growing a fifth chamber in your heart or something, you know. Now, this concept is the main premise behind the old comic book series X-Men, right? That's what X-Men was basically about, is when you examine the population, you should see humans going through the next level of evolution. We shouldn't be the final, you know, peak in evolution. That's not the way it works. But we, of course, see no evidence of this happening. In fact, don't we see the opposite occurring? We're going down, right? We're de-evolving. We got more and more problems building up in our genes. We're not getting better, it's getting worse. As the earth continues to deteriorate in harmony with the second law of thermodynamics. You got to remember that deterioration we talked about last night, it's happening in our actual genes too. Right? Everything is deteriorating. More and more has to be done to try to keep us as alive and healthy. The pre-flood world would have been very different, right? And I talk about this in the other seminar. Y'all need to have me come back and do that other seminar. You just need to get that done. But more and more genetic conditions seem to be arising with these issues. Now, another thing we should see, if evolution were true, you should find vestiges in your body, leftovers from your evolutionary ancestors. So organs that your ancestors had and used, but which we no longer need, and yet they're still just in our body because they haven't been expelled. They're still stuck in our genetic code. And evolutionists have historically acknowledged these vestiges should be present. And so they call them vestigial organs, vestiges of our evolutionary ancestry. Back in 1895, German anatomist Robert Wiedersheim, he claimed to have identified 86 of these. And evolutionists were elated, promoted the idea that vestigial organs prove evolutionary theory. So young people probably have heard about the Scopes trial. Kids, raise your hand if you know what the Scopes trial is. Students, you don't remember this? There was just like the 100th year anniversary, like this last summer on this. This was a major trial in our history because the guys that were spearheading this trial that happened in Tennessee were trying to put into the forefront of the American mind creation versus evolution. Because in Tennessee, they were not allowed to teach evolution. And so they wanted to try this in a court. And so in the court case, they tried to make creation look stupid. And they did a pretty good job making it look silly. And so these are the kind of evidences they were using to try to promote evolution in this court case. And this was a starting point that ultimately led to now evolution being the dominant, what's being taught in the school system. It really went back to that case. So evolutionists were elated when he made this list. And so what kind of things are on this list? One by one, these vestigial organs have been marked off the list, okay? So let's look at six of the often used examples very quickly. This is the big one, appendix, small pouch hanging off the end of the large intestines. For many years, scientists didn't know what it was used for. So evolutionists considered it to be a vestigial organ. One textbook just from a few years ago, 20 years ago now, said in humans, the appendix is an example of a vestigial organ because it carries out no function in digestion. Now, as usual, textbook writers either failed to get the memo or they ignored it, because now scientists know the appendix is an important element of the immune system, especially in children. Lymphoid tissue is in the appendix that produces white blood cells that fight disease and infection, especially when you're young. The appendix is relatively larger in children than it is in adults. And also, recent research indicates the appendix is involved in replenishing the good, beneficial bacteria after certain illnesses eliminate bacteria from your intestines. So bacteria that helps to fight off bad bacteria in your gut. And so the appendix is not a vestigial organ. The tonsils, once again, were thought by scientists to be vestigial, pointless, useless, a vestige of your evolutionary progression. Scientists now know that tonsils help in fighting off germs. The coccyx, another so-called vestigial organ, believed to be an undeveloped tail, and use it as proof that we evolved from monkey-like creatures because they believe it served no other purpose. We now know it's an important organ in human anatomy. It's the point of attachment for several pelvic muscles. It helps us to stand up, erect. Also serves as a shock absorber when you sit down. So if you didn't have the coccyx, you wouldn't be able to sit very well or comfortably. The wisdom teeth have long been considered vestigial organs, the idea being that our supposed ape-like ancestors had larger jaws, and so we can't fit these so easily in our mouth now. So according to them, extra teeth were needed in the past. We don't need them now. And so they tend to become impacted where they ram into other teeth. Well, several problems with this idea. I'll mention just one. Scientists have discovered that dental crowding that causes the impaction of the wisdom teeth is significantly affected by a society's diet. Lombardi, writing in the American Journal of Orthopedics, said dental crowding is endemic among technologically advanced populations and uncommon in primitive groups. In modern man, there is little attrition of the teeth because of a soft processed diet. This can result in dental crowding and impaction of the third molars or the wisdom teeth. So Western diets cause dental crowding and impaction of the third molars or wisdom teeth, not evolution from some ape-like ancestors. So wisdom teeth are not vestigial. What about junk DNA? This evidence has taken center stage in many circles today. Jerry Coyne is an evolutionary geneticist at the University of Chicago. He explained it this way. When a trait is no longer used or becomes reduced, the genes that make it don't instantly disappear from the genome. Evolution stops their action by inactivating them, not snipping them out of the DNA. From this, we can make a prediction. We expect to find in the genomes of many species silenced or dead genes, genes that once were useful but are no longer intact or expressed. In other words, there should be vestigial genes. And he and many others believe that that's exactly what we see in the human genome, vestigial genes or pseudogenes, junk DNA. DNA that maybe our evolutionary ancestors needed, but which we no longer need. But as with vestigial organs, guess what? As scientists dig around and start figuring out more about the human genome, they discover, sure enough, okay, we've been too rash in making this claim because we're finding uses of all of these things we thought were junk. And it's too late to undo the damage that they've done by their false claims. I don't think they're too bent out of shape about it, though. Jonathan Wells is a molecular and cell biologist at the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute in Seattle. And in his book, The Myth of Junk DNA, he cites several prominent evolutionists who used the junk DNA argument. He says the arguments by Dawkins, Miller, Shermer, I've quoted from these guys, Collins, Kitcher, Coyne, I've quoted from him, and Aviz, rest on the premise that most non-protein coding DNA is junk without any significant biological function. Yet a virtual flood of recent evidence shows that they're mistaken. Much of the DNA they claim to be junk actually performs important functions in living cells. The following chapters cite hundreds of scientific articles that testify to those functions, and those articles are only a small sample of a large and growing body of literature on the subject. So the evidence against the junk DNA argument is growing by leaps and bounds, and as was the case with vestigial organs, the more we actually learn about the genome, the more we discover the fact that the universe has been intricately designed with specific purposes in mind. So in truth, there are no vestiges from evolution because we've already seen evolution is not in harmony with the evidence. It actually contradicts it on a very fundamental level. The alleged evidence that is said to be conclusively proving Darwinian evolution is shown to be non-existent. the more scientists learn about the universe. In fact, even if there was such a thing as an organ within the human body that appears to no longer be necessary for humans to have today, it still wouldn't prove Darwinian evolution. Because creationists would argue that the existence of organs like that may say something about the nature of the earth in the past as God originally created it in the pre-flood era. So in other words, if there were such things as useless organs in humans, it may be because we came from other humans of the pre-flood world that lived in such a different environment. The world was so different that, yeah, maybe certain organs aren't as useful today as they would have been in that environment. As the world deteriorates and decays, growing old like a garment, Hebrews 1:11, and our genomes become more and more sick, we would expect to see some things not function the way they were intended to. But bottom line is, ultimately, after scientific knowledge has increased over time, and evolutionists have discovered over and over again that each one of these organs on Wiedersheim's list serve a significant purpose in helping humans, evolutionists have correctly lost faith in this argument and backed away from it. Today, many have all but abandoned the idea, and thankfully so, because a strong argument could be made against evolution that it is a hindrance to scientific progress because of its reliance on these kind of arguments. So think about it. When Wiedersheim made his list of supposed vestigial organs, what do you think the effect of that would have been in medical research? People would have, why would you do research on all those organs? Because you don't really need them. So it would have stunted all growth in our knowledge of these organs. Like the parathyroid gland was on his list, that we now know is essential in regulating your calcium. And so this parathyroid gland attaches onto your thyroid. And so whenever if you ever get your thyroid removed, the surgeons will warn you, hey, I'm going to try to not get your parathyroid glands, but I might actually accidentally do it because it sticks on there. And that'll mess up your calcium from now on. Well, that was on Wiedersheim's list. Okay, so how long did it take for us to figure that out? I mean, the research on these things would have been stunted. Evolution hinders our progress in science because they're coming at it from the wrong direction. They've got the wrong lenses on in the way they're viewing the evidence, and it causes problems for us. How many people have been affected by this? Vestigial organs are a myth. We know there's an important function for these organs, even if we're not knowledgeable enough yet to understand the extent of those functions in many cases. But once again, textbooks still promote this false idea. Young people are being duped into believing evolution by the droves because of this supposed alleged evidence. But don't miss the major implication of this brief look at just a few of the big ones. If evolution were true, there should be vestigial organs. Remember, they said this is a prediction you would make. And remember, if the prediction ends up not being true, what does that do to the theory? It should falsify it if it's a legitimate scientific theory. There should be vestigial organs, and yet they're not there. It's as if the human body came into existence exactly as it is today, as though it was designed, planned, purposed. Wait a minute, that's what the creation model argues. The vestigial organ argument has done nothing but provide more evidence that the creation model is the logical explanation for the origin of the universe. Now, as I've explained in previous sessions, this chart states the fundamental planks of evolution and the opposing stance that the creation model takes. We have looked at the laws of thermodynamics. We've looked at causality. We have looked at biogenesis. We've looked at probability. We've looked at genetics. And so we're gradually just wiping all of these ideas, going through each one of these systematically to show you the evidence does not support these. And now we're looking at all of the alleged evidences that are said to be in support of macroevolution. When we examine these closer, we find, no, we don't have evidence of macroevolution from these things. Genetic or geographic distribution, embryonic growth, similar physical structures, genetic similarities, vestigial organs and genes, horse and whale evolution. None of these can reasonably be used as evidence for macroevolution. So these are major issues that stand in the way of evolution being true. This fifth one here is humans and apes having a common ancestor, and so these evidences we're looking at are speaking against that as well. And once again, the creation model doesn't have a problem with any of this stuff. It's in perfect harmony with biblical creation. All right, so we're going to take another break before we launch into a more in-depth study of the fossil record, which will be fun. Particularly human evolution. I was thinking yesterday before I came, I was thinking about bringing some of my hominid skulls. I thought, man, they're going to get banged up on the plane if I try to do that. But I was going to line them up here where you can see a bunch of, it's something you would probably never see in your life on the Lord's Supper table. A bunch of skulls lined up there. But it would have been cool. All right, let's go ahead and take about a 12-minute break. Thank you for your attention. right, can you hear me? You ready to roll? All right, everybody staying with me pretty well? Can you get up and teach this stuff? It'll take a little bit more for it to sink in, I know, but hopefully you're pulling out some points that you can make and reason with people about. You can always point people to our website for more information, deeper study on any of these things that we're looking at. Again, I hate how much has to be cut out. I've got so much stuff on the fossil record I would love to have time to present. And we're going to only get to do a fraction of that in this session. All right, so remember, you'll usually see a list of a lot of these evidences in textbooks and so forth. So we've looked at all of these. Mitochondrial DNA, I didn't get a chance to look at. This actually has proven to be powerful evidence for the creation model recently, by the way. It fits creationist predictions, not evolution. And I talked about that in the other seminar. Yeah. Horse evolution, whale evolution, vestigial organs. We're going to look at fossil evidence. We've looked at some already. We're going to look at more. And then this we'll look at tomorrow morning during the Bible class hour. And remember, each of these we find can fit as erroneous, irrelevant, or inadequate evidences. So again, I would like to do a session that's just on the general attributes of the fossil record. I'll just give you a brief look at that. Again, according to the leading evolutionists themselves, okay, this is not creationists. Stephen Jay Gould, probably the leading evolutionary paleontologist of the 20th century, Harvard professor. He said there are 3 general characteristics of the fossil record from bottom to top. These aren't just weird exceptions. This is just generally, when you study the fossil record, this is what it looks like. Keeping in mind that a paleontologist is a scientist that studies fossils. Okay? And so they say when you study the fossil record, here's the 3 traits. Number 1, abrupt appearance. So young people, you might write that down. Abrupt appearance. And I've got a video that's probably 11 minutes that will summarize this for you on our website. Abrupt appearance, and I've got a more in-depth article on this. Abrupt appearance is the idea that when creatures show up in the fossil record, they show up abruptly, without any evolutionary history below them that leads up to them. They just show up, ta-da, fully formed and functional. And the most obvious of places where that happens is at the very base of the fossil record in the Cambrian strata. And so they have a name for this explosion of fully formed fossils. It's called the Cambrian explosion. And you might hear that term in your studies. So that's this explosion of creatures that are very diverse, complex. You got some that are simple, some that are complex. They explode across the planet all at one time without any evolutionary history under them. They just, boom, here they are, ta-da. And they're killed in some kind of worldwide event that involves a lot of water because they're found in sedimentary rock. And it's worldwide. It's not localized like you see today, where you might get a creature buried under a lot of sediment from a mudslide or something. This is worldwide graveyard that begins in the Cambrian strata. And then these strata continue on up through the Paleozoic and Mesozoic strata in worldwide layers of sedimentary rock. And it seems to be recording the progression of the flood because it starts out, the first creatures that are taken out are seafloor creatures. Genesis 7:11, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. So the great deep referring to the ocean. So the first creatures taken out are ocean creatures, and then it moves on and starts picking up the fish. And then as the flood progresses towards the coasts, it starts picking up the creatures that live just off the coast and on the coast like amphibians. Then it starts picking up the reptiles that are along the coast. And then it starts moving further inland and starts taking out the birds and the mammals. So the fossil record in those strata seems to be recording for us the progression of the flood, interestingly. Again, then after you get past the Mesozoic, you get into the Cenozoic strata where you no longer have worldwide deposits anymore. They're local like they are today. And the fossil record changes abruptly, very differently. But in these strata, you see abrupt appearance where a creature just, boom, shows up. And there's no evidence that it came from something below it. They have to extrapolate that, but there's no evidence that it did. When the creatures show up, the next trait of the fossil record, according to Stephen Jay Gould, is stasis. So write that down. So abrupt appearance, stasis. What stasis means is they stay the same. So you see the creatures here, and then you look in the strata above them, guess what? They still look the same. They haven't changed. And then you look at the strata above them, they stay the same. That's stasis. So they abruptly appear without ever having any history, and then they stay the same, stasis, and then the third characteristic is extinction. They disappear. They don't change into something else, they just disappear. Now, again, thinking about scientific predictions. If you're an evolutionist, if you're a scientist, you need to be able to make predictions if you've got a theory. If you're an evolutionist, you would predict something very different when you're looking at the fossil record. You would not predict abrupt appearance and stasis. You would predict simple creatures, and then you would predict their evolution gradually into other creatures, and then you'd finally predict those other creatures to emerge, and finally over time you would start getting more and more variety of body types and so forth as you go higher so more and more complexity and different types of body plans and so forth. That's what you'd expect. It's not what you see. The fossil record, you have abrupt appearance without any evolution. They stay the same, they don't evolve, and then they go extinct. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, you would expect diversity of those original species. They would get just varieties of the same creature before disparity. Disparity is the idea that where you've got a lot of big differences in creatures. So from the evolutionary perspective, you think of the evolutionary tree that people will draw with creatures, starting with the single-celled organism. So you would expect diversity of the single-celled organism and eventually disparity over time. Okay? That's not what you see. You see the exact opposite. It's what creationists would predict. We predict there should be disparity, then diversity. Because you've already got the distinct kinds that God made. He creates them. They walk off the ark. They're who get on the ark. They walk off the ark, already distinctly different creatures. And then you would expect diversity within these basic types. So we would say disparity, then diversity. They say there should be diversity, then disparity. And guess which one it fits? It's creationists. Right at the bottom of the fossil record, you have immense disparity with a ton of different body types right off the bat. And then they diversify but stay the same. The basic kinds stay the same. And then they go extinct. Now, extinction would be expected from an evolutionary perspective, but not the kind of extinction you see. So you'd expect the creatures to disappear, but you wouldn't expect mass extinctions. So mass extinctions is when you have a huge number of creatures go extinct all at about the same time. Now, why you wouldn't expect that from an evolutionary perspective is we don't have any big events happening today on the planet that wipe out 70 to 90% of the planet's species. And they're thinking uniformitarianism, which we'll talk about tomorrow morning. So whatever you see going on today in geology, you assume that's always what's happened in the past. And so if you don't have events happening today that would wipe out huge percentages of species, you assume they never happened. We don't have global floods today, so that never happened. Well, according to the evolutionists, there's been not just extinction, but at least 5 mass extinction events in history, if you look based on the fossil record. And they don't even know what caused them. But you've got huge percentages. The Permian extinction has like 95% of the planet's species disappear. They don't even know why. I mean, for all they know, it was a global flood. They have no idea. They have no explanation. Only one of them do they think they know, and it's a meteorite that hit off the coast of Mexico that they think might have wiped out the dinosaurs, but that's controversial. And even if it was true, it doesn't make sense, because why does it wipe out the dinosaurs and leave the bulk of the other creatures? Like, why would the dinosaurs get wiped out? You got like 70% of the species on the planet get wiped out, but a bunch of them survive. You know, what's going on with that? But either way, it doesn't fit the evolutionary paradigm. That you're talking now global catastrophe 5 times. They're more catastrophic than creationists are. We think there was just one global catastrophe. And it, by the way, explains all 5 of those in that single event, because what those different extinctions are is actually the flood progressing to the next habitat. So it's totally wiped out a habitat, and then it wipes out another habitat, and the way it looks in the fossil record is an extinction event. But we would interpret that differently. So bottom line, the general characteristics of the fossil record fit the creation model, not the evolutionary model. Abrupt appearance, stasis, and extinction, particularly mass extinction. I remember whenever I was young thinking, man, the fossil record, I don't know what to do with that. You know, creationists, I didn't hear them talking about it much, and so I didn't know what to do with it. I thought maybe that's a strong argument for evolution. That's not what I think now. The more I've studied this, literally, digging into it, the more I realize this is like the strongest argument for creation. The fossil record is maybe the biggest problem with evolution. There's powerful evidence of creation in the fossil record, in the flood. And so the students, by the way, when they go on this flooded course, we get to study a lot of this more in depth, including getting to see, for example, we get to go study pre-flood trees and do tree ring analysis on them. You guys need to come. I need to come on this. All right. But in spite of that, this is the kind of chart you'll see, young people. Ran across this chart. Evolution, we have the fossils. We win. It's over. The debate is over. We got this. We got the evidence. Well, you've already seen from the get-go, this is going to be silly, whatever it is. It's not going to be true, because we've already totally disproved evolution. We're just being thorough here. But this is what they say about human evolution. And by the way, I've got copies of all these skulls, by the way, and many, many more at our offices there at AP that I can walk you through if you get to come by and visit Montgomery ever. So is this true? Well, let's look at the actual evidence and see what's going on here. First of all, what would we expect if evolution were true? If the literal account of creation in Genesis 1 is true, there should be a notable absence of transitional forms in the fossil record, because God created creatures according to their kind. So any transitions is really just going to be variety in the same kind. But what we're talking about is transitioning into a completely different kind of creature. You're not going to see that in the fossil record. So there shouldn't be creatures in the fossil record or alive today that are half pig, half zebra or something, like some kind of weird mythological creature, right? You're not going to expect to see that. Instead, if the creation model is true, the fossil record should show fully functional, distinct types of creatures when they appear in fossilized form. But if evolution is true, and there's been a gradual transformation in living creatures over millions of years, all the way back to the original single-celled organism, you should see evidence of these gradual changes in the fossil record. So evolutionists realize and admit that the fossil record should reveal these transitional forms. Well, there's a lot we could say about the problems with this, but let's just focus in on the human evolution issue in particular in this lesson, and that is the evidences that are said to prove that we evolved from a common ancestor that we share with the apes, right? Our distant cousins, they would say. So that is the evidence that is probably proclaimed the loudest in support of human evolution. It's the fossil record. And yet when we look closely at this, once again, you've got 3 categories of evidence that emerge. And none of them are good for evolution. You've got inadequate evidences, in other words, insufficient evidence to prove evolution is true compared to creation. Erroneous evidence, in other words, evidences that were once used to prove human evolution, but which now are recognized to have been errors on the part of evolutionists who used those evidences in the past. And then you have irrelevant evidences, so evidence of microevolutionary change, not macro, which is the kind of change that Darwin really was arguing for. that a single-celled organism can turn into any kind of, that's not the kind he was arguing for. He was arguing that a single-celled organism could change into all the different species over time, regardless of how different it is. So in other words, remember, we don't argue for absolutely no change, no evolution within these groups of animals. We would predict that there's a lot of change that happens within the kinds, like the varieties of the dogs. But this is microevolution, but we would say there isn't evidence that one kind of animal can evolve into something completely different. A dinosaur can't evolve into a bird. They were both created on different days, with, ironically, the birds being before the dinosaurs, right? So evidences of microevolution are irrelevant to proving Darwinian evolution, because Darwinian evolution argues for evolution across phylogenetic boundaries, what we would call macroevolution. So inadequate, erroneous, and irrelevant evidences highlight that human evolution is a house of cards not based on actual evidence. It requires a blind faith to accept it. And in fact, the fossil evidence falsifies evolution, which is no wonder Stephen Jay Gould said that the evolutionist fossil record dilemma is an uncomfortable paradox. Okay. How so? Well, again, I've got an article that goes into this in depth that is designed to highlight this, but besides those inadequate, irrelevant, and erroneous evidences, again, we're going to see this with regard to the human evolutionary idea. There's inadequate evidence for this. Notice what Charles Darwin said when he recognized this problem back in the 1800s when he was developing his theory. In The Origin of Species, right, his book, he said, the number of intermediate varieties, he's talking about these transitional creatures that are intermediate between the creature they came from and the creature they're evolving into, the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed must be truly enormous, right? Because every species had to have evolved from other species. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and serious objection which can be argued against this theory. So Darwin realized probably the best argument against the theory he was coming up with is the fossil record. That's not how they paint it today. But those are people that are either lying or, want to be gracious, they're probably just ignorant. They don't really know what's going on with the fossil record. So Darwin makes up his version of naturalistic evolution and believes in it anyway, even though the fossil record doesn't support it. And that's the main thing he could have used to prove it, but he just ignored that issue. It's a serious objection that he said was most obvious, and that was the lack of these transitional forms. There should be transitional forms. They'd be predicted to exist, and yet they're not there. The theory should have been scrapped right then, but it wasn't. Why is that? Well, it wasn't the evidence. He admitted the evidence didn't support his theory on that point. And as well with many, as it was with Darwin, it was because biblical creation wasn't an option that they liked. We're going to talk about that during the worship hour tomorrow. They didn't want God in the picture for whatever reason, and nothing's really changed. That's the way man has always been. Well, in the words of Gould, evolutionists have no direct evidence for smooth transitions. If Darwin was right, there should be transitional forms everywhere. They should be between these distinct types of creatures that are supposedly related. So you'd have an ape-like creature and a human, and in between, and you'd have these creatures that should be half ape creature, half human, bridging the gap. And a creature between the half human and the human as well, and everywhere in between. There should be thousands of these transitional forms providing a smooth transition between the ancestor and humans, proving that humans evolved from that supposed ancestor, and yet there's no direct evidence of that prediction. In fact, he admitted, all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. Okay? There's no evidence that this turned into this. It's like, okay, we got this creature, and then boom, we got this creature. There's no evidence, there's just an abrupt change. There's no evidence that this actually gradually turned into that. It's just they change all of a sudden. Or in other words, they're not related, right? That's another possible interpretation here. And keep in mind when he talks about there's precious little in the way of intermediate forms, keep in mind even those are hotly debated among evolutionists, like Tiktaalik and Archaeopteryx that we looked at, where people have backed away from those over time as they get studied. Abruptness characterizes the fossil record, not transition, not evolution, just distinct creatures. They appear, they remain the same, and then they disappear. Notice what he says in paleobiology. He explained in apparent exasperation the absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages, right, these transitional creatures, between major transitions in organic design. Indeed, our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates, in many cases, has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. So there's an absence of these fossilized species that should provide the bridge to the gaps. There's just distinct types of creatures. We can't even construct in our imaginations what they should look like, he says, because the changes are so abrupt. They're so different, these creatures. And he says it is a major problem. It has nagged evolutionists. Why has it nagged them? Well, because they should be there, and yet it's not. It doesn't matter how much they dig, they can't find it. It's nagging them because it's bothering them that it disproves their theory. It's not what you should predict to find. And it's been persistent. In other words, it goes all the way back to when Darwin was talking about this. It's not like this is led up. You'd expect with 150, 170 more years of research, they would have had more evidence to help support their position, but that's not what they're finding. The problem has persisted. It's continuing to nag them.
Are these the missing links they talk about?
Yes, these are the missing links. Now, so people that bring up these missing links, like Archaeopteryx, would be considered a missing link. When they bring these up, they ultimately end up finding out, okay, this isn't what we thought. So anybody that continues to promote them are just ignorant. They don't really know what's gone on in the literature on this. So, but the guy's in the know. Okay, this is a guy that you would say he's in the know. I mean, he's the leading evolutionary paleontologist, Harvard, okay, Ivy League guy. And he recognized this is a major problem. In fact, like the Cambrian explosion so bothered him that he spent his life trying to come up with an explanation for how to deal with this from an evolutionary perspective, and died without a legitimate explanation. I'll tell you what he did come up with later, I think. Notice what he says here. This is a telling quote. Okay, try to follow the jargon here. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. In other words, there's an extreme rarity of these transitional forms, the missing gaps, right? The missing fossils, the fossil, I forgot, what was the term you said? The missing links, that's right, missing links. There's an extreme rarity of these, and he acknowledges this is a trade secret of paleontology. In other words, they don't highlight this in the textbooks. Like, hey, students, we don't have many of these. No, it's a trade secret. They keep this kind of close to the chest. They don't let this out of the bag, because it would be, like Darwin said, it would be the strongest argument against evolution if everybody knew this. So they don't broadcast it. All right, he goes on. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data, the actual evidence, only at the tips and nodes of their branches. In other words, you get this evolutionary tree in your textbook. Okay, here's this supposed ape-like ancestor, and you get this tree that they draw. The data, the actual evidence from the fossils is only at the tips in the nodes. Nothing in between that would prove that whatever the node creature was actually turned into the tip creature. There's no evidence to fill in the gap. So again, the evolutionary trees in your textbook only have data at the tips and nodes of their branches, and he goes on. The rest is inference. however reasonable, not the evidence of the fossils. All right, so you got the tips, you got the nodes, everything in between, okay, we just infer that. In other words, we know evolution is true, so we know that there were species in there, but, we're not too worried about it. The actual evidence of the fossils, it's not there. All right, again, I ask you, who's got the blind faith here? I mean, have I proven that well the last 2 days?
Hey Jeff, when you
Yeah.
say the Cambrian explosion, is that the evolutionist lens of like the global flood? Is that what you're saying?
What do you mean lens?
Like what they're perceiving with, is that what you're talking about when you say all the species got eliminated? Is that what they would call the Cambrian explosion?
Okay, so the Cambrian explosion is whenever you're looking at the rock strata, I'll tell you what, remind me at the very end, and what I'll do is I'll pull up a chart, and I'll kind of walk you through what's going on with all that, because I think that's a good question. Let's do that. All right, but anyway, bottom line is blind faith here is what we're talking about. Human evolution is a blind faith issue. Even though it won't feel like that, young people, because the ignorant people, which I'm sad to say would be most of your teachers, they're ignorant on this. They don't really know what the leading evolutionary paleontologists of the world are saying. Okay, so whenever they shove this stuff down your throat, they'll say it so as though this is truth. I was just contacted by one of my interns, by the way, from last summer. And she is working at a state park up in, I think, Virginia. And she doesn't want to give the party line that they're expected to state about the fossil record and the age of the earth. And so her boss just found out that she hadn't been given that party line and that she's talking about other stuff. And so he called her into the office and said, well, you don't need to be talking about that stuff. You just point, you don't have to say it if you don't want to, so you don't feel like you're lying. Just point people over to your colleagues and let them talk about it. Right? I mean, why are you so confident about this? Like, her boss clearly is ignorant about this. He shouldn't have even from an evolutionary perspective, the leading guys don't push this as hard as the underlings do. They're more adamant about this. At least the leaders are they're like, okay, we haven't really proven our case here on some of this. They're at least honest about it. They're the ones really going out and finding the fossils. So she was contacting me, how should I deal with this, right? So I was dealing with that this morning before I came here.
I think it's important to note when you say ignorant, you're not meaning it in a mean way.
Yeah, no, and I'm not saying they're ignorant about everything, but this topic, they do not understand the truth because they will only know what the textbook tells them, And even the textbook writers, textbooks are notorious for being behind the times on scientific issues. They just are. They're notorious for that. Once things get in there, they'll stay there for a long time. It takes them a long time to get out. And they'll be way behind the times on scientific issues. But I would argue that the bulk of people that believe in evolution, that are the ones teaching it, they want it to be true. And so they will ignore the memos sometimes and keep shoving it down your throat, even if it doesn't fit the evidence. That's not every case, though. Now, Colin Patterson was the paleontologist who served as the editor of the professional journal published by the British Museum of Natural History in London. Okay, big-time evolutionary paleontologist. He literally wrote the textbook on evolution. And he was the paleontologist who served there at the British Museum of Natural History in London. And somebody wrote in a letter saying, hey, in your textbook on evolution, you don't talk about transitional forms in there. What's that about? He said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. Yet Gould, right, Stephen Jay Gould, and the American Museum people, American Museum of Natural History, are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional fossils. I'll lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. In other words, every one of them is heavily debated. There's not one that and keep in mind, this is not just humans. This is every species on the planet. I mean, come on, if evolution happened, this shouldn't be so hard to find some. David B. Kitts, evolutionary geologist, paleontologist, professor of geology and history of science at Oklahoma University. He said, despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it's presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. If evolution is true, the fossil record should abound with these transitional forms, and yet they're just not there, leaving gaps. Oxford University evolutionist Mark Ridley even said, no real evolutionist, whether gradualistic or punctuationist, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. If you're a real if you really know your stuff, you're not going to try to use the fossil record to prove evolution and disprove creation, or you will lose that debate. All right? If they try to go into a debate with creationists and use the fossil record, they're going down. That's what he's saying. So they're going to want to stay away from that issue if they know their stuff. If they're a real evolutionist, they've really studied this out. Even after a century of searching for fossils to substantiate human evolution, Lyle Watson, a well-known evolutionary biologist and zoologist, said, the fossils that decorate our family tree are so scarce that there's still more scientists than specimens. The remarkable fact is that all the physical evidence we have for human evolution can still be placed with room to spare inside a single coffin. And I think that is ironic because it means death for evolution. I mean, this should falsify the theory. And we've run across quite a few of those. Evolutionists make predictions. The evidence doesn't fit it. It should falsify the theory. And they're not letting it falsify it because this isn't about evidence. This to them is a religious zeal. You know, they want to be religious about this. They just don't want the restraints that God would impose on them. They don't want that God. But they've made this their form of God. According to evolutionists themselves, the fossil record with regard to human evolution is meager at best. Kate Wong of Scientific American, she said, the origin of our genus Homo is one of the biggest mysteries facing scholars of human evolution. Based on the meager evidence available, scientists have surmised that Homo arose in East Africa. Okay, so meager is the evidence that paleontologists often have to rely on just a few isolated bones, or usually bone fragments, that are found isolated around the world to try to construct the supposed tree of human evolution. Wong continued, for decades, paleoanthropologists, these are paleontologists that study human and the hominids, humans and what they think evolved into the humans, they have combed remote corners of Africa on hand and knee for fossils of Homo's earliest representatives. Understand that Homo is talking about the genus Homo, or Homo sapiens. You got Homo naledi, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo floresiensis, Homo erectus. You've heard probably of some of these. Homo's earliest, okay, so we've been looking around for Homo's earliest representatives. Their efforts have brought only modest gains, a jawbone here, handful of teeth there. Most of the recovered fossils instead belong to either ancestral Australopithecines, who they think we evolved from, or later members of Homo, creatures too advanced to illuminate the order in which our distinctive traits arose. So in other words, there's a gap between the Australopithecines and humans, right? So we're finding stuff that's either down here or up here. We don't have anything between. It's as though they're two separate groups that didn't evolve from one another. With so little to go on, the origin of our genus has remained as mysterious as ever. Mariette de Christina, editor-in-chief of Scientific American, admitted pieces of our ancient forebears generally are hard to come by. However, scientists working to interpret our evolution often have had to make do with studying a fossil toe bone here or a jaw there. All right, not much to go on. You think you might make mistakes? Colin Barras of New Scientist described the available fossil evidence for human evolution as part of a face here or a jawbone fragment there. So fossil finds, he said, don't amount to discoveries of an entire hominid skeleton where you find the whole body. Rather, they generally amount to just a few fragments rather than complete skeletons. And so we have to ask, are fragments of toe bones, faces, and jawbones enough evidence to substantiate human evolution? Or is the fossil evidence for human evolution inadequate, right? Our first category of human evolution evidence. So what does evolution have to substantiate itself? A few bones here and there, generally fragments. Even those are heavily debated by evolutionary paleontologists. Richard Lewontin is a research professor at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. They call him one of their most brilliant evolutionary biologists, according to their website. He says this: the main problem is the poor fossil record. Despite a handful of hominid fossils stretching back 4 million years or so, we can't be sure that any of them are on the main ancestral line to us. Many of them could have been evolutionary side branches. All of the supposed fossil evidence for human evolution may not be ancestors of humans at all. There may be, to date, literally no evidence in the fossil record that humans evolved from non-human species, even according to their own leading guys. In Human Diversity, he wrote, when we consider the remote past before the origin of the actual species Homo sapiens, we are faced with a fragmentary and disconnected fossil record. Despite the excited and optimistic claims that have been made by some paleontologists, no fossil hominid species can be established as our direct ancestor. Lord Solly Zuckerman was a famous zoologist, anatomist, and British scientific advisor, as well as professor at Oxford, and he studied the Australopithecines for over 15 years. Years ago, he admitted if man did descend from an ape-like ancestor, he did so without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of that transformation. Now, I'll grant some of these quotes have been older, but based on the literature, they're still representative of the current state of evolutionary thinking. I think these are excellent articulations of the problem for evolution, and so I like to highlight those. But there are recent quotes that highlight the problem as well. They just aren't usually as concise and clear. So, for example, Bernard Wood is a paleoanthropologist and professor at George Washington University, as well as an adjunct senior scientist at the National Museum of Natural History. So this is a current leading paleoanthropologist. And Alexis Lutku of George Washington University, who's another paleoanthropologist, they wrote an article in American Scientist. And the title of the article said it all: The Inevitably Incomplete Story of Human Evolution. And notice what they acknowledge. This quote blows me away. And that's the whole point of this article. They're trying to get everybody to see, guys, the story here, it's not so conclusive as everybody's talking about it. Reconstructing that braided rope, talking about the human evolutionary lineage, would be a scientific challenge in any case, but it's all the more difficult because of major gaps in the fossil record, right? So these gaps are still there. They never have been fixed. Major gaps. Okay, why might that be? And they warn all modern paleoanthropologists, the existing human fossil record is incomplete in almost all respects, with little chance that any narrative explanation offered today can be the right one. Okay, so the narratives where people are like, okay, here, how you go and Google, use AI. Okay, what's the story of human evolution? And it'll give you a narrative. Here's what we think happened. There's little chance that any of that is the right one. Okay, and when you see in the textbook, oh, we know that humans evolved from creatures in Africa, and we think they were like this, and remember, whatever narrative they give, there's little chance that any narrative is the right one. Why? Because the whole fossil record is so incomplete. They have little to go on. Evolution is not being proved by this. They go on. They highlight that evolution isn't clear in the fossil record, but don't you get the impression from evolutionists that it is clear, that it's been proven? Like I showed you that chart, evolution, we have the fossils, we win, it's over, victory. I mean, it's billed like that. And if you don't believe this, Dawkins said, remember, he said, you meet somebody who doesn't believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane. That's what you got. Those are your three options. It can't be that you're right. Can't be that. You either just don't know enough, like Richard Dawkins, or you're stupid, you're just not smart enough to even know, or you're just crazy, which is what creationists apparently are, right? Because you can't make the other two arguments about us. You guys are crazy. So according to evolutionists, evolution is proven. But notice again, Wood and Ulutku, who are leading paleontologists, they admit that's not true. And in their article, they correctly highlight and warn other paleontologists that creationists, they come out and talk about creationists in this article. They say creationists have historically capitalized on these evolutionists that are boldly pronouncing these statements about evolution. And these guys, these evolutionists, are ignorant about this. And so creationists are capitalizing on it. And he highlights paleoanthropologists' blunders that have been made over the years that prove evolution isn't a proven fact like they claim, and proves that you can't really trust them, the evolutionists, because they make these pronouncements that end up being false. So that's one of the points that Wood is trying to do. Wood and Ulutku, they're trying to improve the credibility of the paleontological community. Because people are like, okay, I don't trust you guys because you keep having to back out of your arguments here. So they're trying to get everybody to just calm down. Evolutionists, calm down. Don't overstate our case here. That's what they're trying to do, right? Notice what they say. Accounts based on incomplete data, accounts of what? He's talking about human evolution. Whenever we come out there and make these accounts, tell these narratives that are based on incomplete data sets, that can sometimes misleadingly sound definitive. You can give people the impression that we've got this all worked out. You can mislead people. I think that's a really nice way of them trying to not make the paleontological community, they're subtly chiding them. Do you see that? There's a little bit of a rebuke here. He's basically saying, I know y'all don't mean to give the impression to everybody that this is a proven fact, but, that can accidentally mislead people, okay? You need to, back off. No, there's nothing unintentional about what they're doing. You're telling me it's unintentional when they start removing from the textbook parts that are keeping everybody from believing this garbage? Notice what they say. It is accepted practice in paleoanthropology. This is what everybody does. It's considered acceptable to present detailed reconstructions of human evolutionary history. They tell you, okay, here's what happened. Just believe us, we know because we are very knowledgeable. We got like 3 PhDs after our name, so we are pretty much omniscient. Okay, so it's accepted practice for these guys to present detailed reconstructions of human evolutionary history that rarely acknowledge the extent to which they are incomplete and bound to change. They don't come out and say, okay, now guys, let's be humble about this. No, there's not going to be humility involved. We got to warn you, this is kind of what we're thinking right now, but we don't have a lot of evidence. They're not going to want to say that. And probably, even when I tell you this, it's probably going to change next year. They're not going to tell you that because they want to come across like they are somebody you should trust and follow, right? And yet it's accepted practice to do that. He says, but this practice does a disservice to all concerned. It would be more helpful as well as more accurate to acknowledge that the hominin fossil record is incomplete and that there are therefore limits to what can be said about it, which is what creationists have been saying for decades. Like they're stating this and convincing everybody that this is true, going way beyond what the evidence says, and they expect everybody to just believe them. Well, it's working effectively, except that there is a growing divide between the people that don't accept evolution. They're not being able to convert everybody. They've led the public to believe this, though. But there's gaps. Well, my respect for Wood and Alutku and those like them increased dramatically because at least they're being transparent and honest about that, and few of them are like this. Notice what they admit here. Hypotheses involving extinct taxa. Okay, we're talking about fossils, creatures that are extinct, and they're like, okay, what are these creatures? They inevitably rest on evidence from the bones and teeth that are preserved in the fossil record, right? The hardest stuff, that's the stuff that gets preserved, none of the flesh. Unfortunately, the hard tissues of some types of living monkeys and apes can look so similar that it's almost impossible to tell which bone or tooth comes from which species. Right? What does that tell you? What are they really looking at when they find these? Are these really what they seem to be, or is it possible they've just found an ape deeper in the strata? So much of it is just how you interpret the fossil based on your worldview. It's not demanding one way or another. And this is called confirmation bias. The tendency to see what you expect to see instead of letting the evidence tell you. Confirmation bias, they explain, is the all too human tendency to see what we expect or hope to see, sometimes at the cost of seeing accurately. Rarely operating at a conscious level, we rarely do this on purpose. Confirmation bias involves focusing on and giving excessive weight to evidence that supports an already favored conclusion, like evolution, while overlooking or devaluing, not considering it as important, evidence to the contrary. You downplay that stuff. Now notice, he says probably the best known example of confirmation bias in this field centers on a fossil that eventually proved to be no more than a hoax, the notorious Piltdown Man. I'll talk about that. One of the dangers of confirmation bias is that it can lead individuals, including researchers, to reach conclusions prematurely, before you have enough evidence, which stops the search for objective evidence because they perceive the case for an outcome to be stronger than it actually is. The result can be to prop up incorrect hypotheses or theories, or to promote overconfidence in a hypothesis, right, where they come out so arrogantly, we win, it's over. So bottom line, the fossil evidence for human evolution is inadequate at best, and yet the bulk of the evolutionary community blindly believes it with religious fervor. Evolutionary paleoanthropologist Lee Berger of the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He's become famous over the last 15 years or so because he discovered Australopithecus sediba and Homo naledi, which are probably the biggest hominin fossil finds of the last maybe 50 years, but he admitted there's a lack of human evolution evidence in the fossil record. And yet his blind faith in evolution isn't shaken by the fact that there isn't evidence for what he strongly believes. He boldly but baselessly proclaimed, we really need a better record, and it's out there. Guys, just believe us. Trust us. The priests of the evolutionary community. Okay, how do you know that, Berger? Well, you don't know that, but you blindly believe it anyway? In just a few more years, evolutionary paleontologists will have been looking for 2 centuries since Darwin for that better record that should prove evolution, and yet they haven't found it. Okay, question. Is it possible that human evolution never happened? No, that's not possible. You heretic. You must be ignorant, stupid, or insane. So bottom line, there's inadequate evidence for human evolution. There should be billions of transitional fossils. They're not there. Now, a person can continue to believe in evolution if he wants to, but number one, he'll have to do it with a blind faith. And number two, he has to do that realizing there's a logical alternative that actually fits the evidence. Our predictions are being borne out as we study the fossil record. Creation. But another type of fossil evidence is erroneous evidence. In other words, these are fossils which at first proclaimed to be evidence of evolution, broadcast far and wide as being that, only to later be found out not to be evidence of human evolution at all. A blunder was made, and no wonder, because again, the supposed evidences that they bring in are, in the words of evolutionists themselves, meager at best. Teeth, jawbones, pieces of isolated bones are bound to make mistakes. And that truth is what Lee Berger highlighted a few years ago. So again, he's the guy that discovered Australopithecus sediba and Homo naledi. Sediba was a huge fossil find, and recently Homo naledi was amazing too. Writing in Scientific American, he chides the standard practice in paleontology where they draw too much information about what a creature looks like from these single isolated bones, because that practice inevitably leads to mistakes, right? So he's talking the same way Wood and Alutku were earlier. So the Sediba skeletons he found were more complete than typical fossil finds, and yet his were nowhere near to even being 50% complete fossil skeletons. And yet he made the key point that if any one of the bones that he found had been found isolated in different places rather than together where they know it belonged to the same skeleton. So in other words, if they had been found the way they usually are found, just isolated bones, paleontologists would have drawn completely different conclusions about what the creature looked like what species it is. He said Sediba shows that one can no longer assign isolated bones to a genus, which is, a huge point. Again, creationists have been making this point for decades. This is another example of where evolution is causing a hindrance to the progress of science. Because of their preconceived ideas, they refuse to let the evidence speak for itself. They take their ideas and shove it onto whatever evidence and force it to say what they want it to say instead of letting it speak. That is holding back the progress of paleontology when they do that. So Wood concurred with Berger, and he said Berger's absolutely right. Isolated bones do not predict what the rest of the animal looks like. Now, is it likely that many will listen to Wood and Berger on this? No way. Because the vast majority of these fossil finds that allegedly prove human evolution are based on isolated bones like this. What are some of the mistakes that have been made over the years that they allude to? Based on the evolutionists' own words, proof of human evolution is already based on meager evidence. That evidence, without exception, is either debatable, hence the debate among the evolutionists themselves over these, or worse, the evidence ends up being a flat-out hoax or major blunder that makes them look silly. For example, in 2009, a fossilized skeleton was discovered given the name Ida, and the media and evolutionists were quick to dub Ida as a missing link, a transitional form. The Norwegian fossil scientist of the Oslo Natural History Museum that was the co-discoverer of Ida said this is the first link to all humans, truly a fossil that links world heritage, right? Again, notice how they state this, as though it's proven. And notice Sir David Attenborough, he said, the little creature is going to show us our connection with all the rest of the mammals. The link they would have said until now is missing. It's no longer missing, boys. Here it is. No more missing link. Boom. Year and a half later, after other scientists had examined Ida, evolutionary anthropologist Blythe William, Richard Kay of Duke, Chris Kirk at University of Texas at Austin, and Callum Ross, University of Chicago, they did their own study on Ida. And they found this guy's not an evolutionary missing link between humans and this ape-like creature. Well, what was she? Well, according to their research, Ida is just a forebearer of modern-day lemurs and lorises, which you can see. Oh, yeah, that kind of fits, right? Well, that's not the way they proclaimed it. So remember that when they first come out with these big studies, they talk just grandiose. Did everybody believe us? And then you feel like, oh, it's kind of like, remember the Big Bang inflation thing last night? Oh man, I guess the Big Bang's been proven. We finally have evidence of inflation. Throw your Bibles out. Let's have a big Bible burning. No, just give it some more time. You're going to find the truth on this stuff. You never have to distrust what the Bible says. Neanderthal man. very famous missing link fossils, supposed to be a missing link between ape-like non-human creatures and humans. Eric Trinkhaus, evolutionary anthropologist, Washington University in St. Louis, one of the world's foremost authorities on Neanderthals, concluded detailed comparisons of Neanderthal skeletal remains with those of modern humans have shown that there's nothing in Neanderthal anatomy that conclusively indicates locomotor, manipulative, intellectual, or linguistic abilities inferior to those of modern humans. So Neanderthal man's anatomy is just as modern as human anatomy today. There's nothing about them that would indicate they're not as intelligent or something. And on top of that, modern human fossil remains have been found near the remains of Neanderthals that have been dated as being older than the alleged dates of the Neanderthals. So how could modern humans evolve from the Neanderthals if the Neanderthals date to a time after modern humans came along? And driving a nail into the coffin of the Neanderthal narrative, we now know from genetic analysis that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals have actually mated in the past, which is a hallmark evidence that we're both human. And there's the recent research by the team working on sequencing the Neanderthal genome. They sequenced the genome. Here's what they found. The leader of the team, Ed Green, who's assistant professor of biomolecular engineering at UC Santa Cruz, he said this about Neanderthal DNA. 2 chimpanzees are roughly as different in DNA sequence as a human and a Neanderthal. Okay, so if you were to do a DNA sequence of 2 modern chimpanzees, they're both acknowledged to be chimpanzees, the DNA is not going to match exactly. Right? So the amount of variety between those 2 chimps, you see the same between modern humans and Neanderthals. What does that tell you? 2 chimps, 2 humans. Neanderthals are just humans. Now granted, it's a variety of humans that is found in the post-flood strata. There's a lot of variety among the humans, just like there is among all the animals. And this is just one of those groups of humans that show up there. Back in 1891, evolutionists found fossilized teeth, the upper part of a skull, and a thigh bone on the banks of the Solo River in the Dutch Indies, and they assumed they were from a transitional creature. And from these few bones, they presumptuously drew what they thought that creature would have looked like, calling him Java Man. Isn't it amazing what you can come up with based on just a few fossils? Well, over time, scientists found that the leg bone and teeth were actually from a human and the skull cap was from a monkey. A few years after this find, while Java Man was still famous, 1926, Professor Eberlein of the Dutch Medical Service found what appeared to be a complete cranium in the same area that Java Man had been discovered, and seemingly like this alleged Java Man skull. And so again, the fossil was hailed as more evidence of this transitional creature species. And then a year later, Time ran a retraction. You got to go into Time, look at the very back in small print. And in the retraction, the Smithsonian Institute said that the cranium was actually the kneecap of an elephant. So no transitional creature here. Piltdown Man that was mentioned earlier is a big problem for evolutionists. In 1912, a doctor found a jawbone and a portion of a skull in a gravel pit in England, assumed that the fossils were from a transitional creature they called Piltdown Man. And from these items, they made a skull to show what they thought this transitional creature's head would have looked like. And this one took a few decades before Piltdown Man was discovered to be a fake, a fraud. The skull fossil was found to be from a modern human, and the jawbone was from an ape. And in fact, the fossilized teeth had been filed and treated chemically to make them look older. So definitely no transitional fossil here. And again, this is acknowledged by them. This is not creationists making this point. 1922, newspapers printed a picture of male and female human-like creatures that evolutionists had drawn based on one fossil tooth they had found, which they claimed was from a prehistoric transitional creature. Once again, wow, isn't it amazing what you can come up with? This is one tooth, just different angles of the same tooth, right? Writing in Science magazine, Michael Balter discusses his interview with anthropologist Adrian Zillman at the University of California, Santa Cruz, who highlighted eye-opening practices of those evolutionists that are working to sort out human evolution. In her view, much of the work that human evolution researchers do today is based on conjecture as well as hard science. So some of it's like, well, this is what we think. And some of it's the actual hard science. The paleo artists, right, these are the guys that are drawing these pictures that are very influential. The paleo artists, Zillman told Science, are doing what the rest of us do. Most of what we do is part art and part science, all right? So what part? I mean, is it like 50-50 or is it 90-10 or is it more like 99.9 to 0.1? Which is what you're talking about if you're talking about a single tooth, right? Well, the creature they came up with, they called Nebraska man, also called Hesperopithecus. But guess what? Within 5 years, scientists had decided that the tooth was actually from a wild pig, not a transitional creature. All right, another example of the dangers caused by paleo artists taking liberties seems to be Hobbit Man. In 2004, paleontologists digging on the small Indonesian island of Flores discovered a few bones from 7 different individuals that they hadn't even yet completely fossilized. And the most complete individual discovered, that they call LB1, which consisted of most of the skull as well as some of the leg, hands, feet, and pelvis bones, was thought to be a species of its own and given the Latin name Homo floresiensis. The media called it Hobbit Man because it is thought to have been 3.5 foot tall guy. So Michael Lemonick, writing in Time magazine, he said, what makes the discovery truly shocking is that the beings were not, like the pygmies of equatorial Africa, just a short variety of modern Homo sapiens. Dubbed Homo floresiensis, they represent an entirely new twig on the human family tree. The chapter of biology textbooks that describes our family tree will have to be rewritten. And they were. Over the next decade, floresiensis started appearing in biology textbooks and life science textbooks. Well, guess what? A bit more investigation, other paleontologists came out in disagreement with the initial interpretation of the fossils. The Huffington Puffington Post began their announcement of the latest study with the question, were scientists all wrong about prehistoric hobbits? They thought they had a new species on their hands with Homo floresiensis, but 2 new studies indicate the skull that affected their interpretation may have just been from a modern human with Down syndrome. So when measurements were taken of the thigh bones, skull circumference, and cranial volume and compared to previous figures, the bones were found to fall in the typical range of modern humans that have Down syndrome. So a professor of developmental genetics and evolution at Penn State, one of the authors of one of the studies, Robert Eckhart, he said the difference is significant and the revised figure falls in the range predicted for a modern human with Down syndrome from the same geographic region. So according to some paleontologists anyway, Hobbit man really may just be a modern man, Homo sapiens. It's possible that it's another variety of humans from the post-flood period there. The bottom line is, and isn't that amazing, how far off they can be on this. In the words of Matthew Cobb, professor of zoology at the University of Manchester, writing in New Scientist, he said, it's embarrassing but true. Some of the most influential drawings in the history of biology are wrong, exaggerated to fit a thesis. And the remains of Rhodesian man were found in a zinc mine in 1921, displayed at the British Museum of Natural History for years. The fossilized hips had been crushed, which caused the displayers to portray the creature at the time as stooped over. Once again, years later, actual anatomists examined the fossils, and Rhodesian man was found to be merely a modern human. A Heidelberg man named Homo heidelbergensis was based off of a single lower jawbone initially when they made up this species, pictured here on the left next to a Homo sapiens on the right. So Heidelberg man was recognized by the guy that found him, Daniel Hartmann, to be very human-like. And so he knew he belonged in the genus Homo, but it was found lower in the strata. And notice it's pretty big. Apparently too big for Hartmann to consider to be Homo sapiens. So according to Donald Johanson, who was the paleoanthropologist that discovered the Lucy fossils. Hartman decided to give him a special name and put him in his own species in spite of its strong similarity to the human jawbone. Well, guess what, Mr. Hartman? Just because it's bigger, it doesn't mean it's not human. I'd like to see, the wrestler Andre the Giant's jawbone. What would that look like? Or Goliath's jawbone next to a normal-sized human jawbone. That may be what we're seeing here with this group that lived in the post-flood world. 1979, what appeared to be a collarbone was found at a site named Sahabi in Libya, and some scientists believed it belonged to a primitive ape man. And after further investigation, the collarbone was found to be not a collarbone, but a rib of not a human-like creature, but a sea mammal, similar to not an ape man, but a dolphin. Okay, so you'd think if transitional creatures ever existed, it wouldn't be so hard to find their remains. Early 1980s, a portion of a skull, just a skull cap, was found near the Spanish village of Orsay. Evolutionists, once again, were quick to pronounce that the fragment was from an ancient human child. And from that small fragment, they constructed an entire human they called Orsay man. Later, the bone was conceded as likely being the skull cap of a 6-month-old donkey. What about Cro-Magnon man? What's all the talk about this guy? Is he proof of evolution? Evolutionists claim that Cro-Magnons were the first creatures with a skeleton that looked absolutely modern anatomically. And recent genetic research by a team of European geneticists from the universities of Ferrara and Florence showed that a Cro-Magnon man who lived in southern Italy was a modern European genetically as well. Okay, so if it looked like us anatomically and it was like us genetically, what's the difference? Now granted, it's deeper in the fossil record than where Homo sapiens should be, but if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, in this case bleeds like a duck, it's a duck. This is no missing link. Cro-Magnon man is just a modern man. So once again, genetic evidence reveals Cro-Magnons mated with Homo sapiens, proving we're both humans. We're part of the human kind. July of 1866, Josiah Whitney, the head of California's Geological Survey, unveiled his discovery of a skull that had been found in Calaveras County and presenting a paper to the California Academy of Natural Sciences. And this was discovered in a mine shaft below volcanic deposits that had been dated using evolutionary dating methods to be 1 million years old. And that would make this the oldest known human-like being on the continent. However, it looked very much like the skull of a modern Native American. So William Holmes, who's a Smithsonian archaeologist, he wrote, quote, "To suppose that man could have remained unchanged physically, to suppose that he could have remained unchanged mentally, socially, industrially, and aesthetically for 1 million years, roughly speaking, is to suppose a miracle." So either the skull is extremely old and proof that evolution didn't happen over 1 million years, which would disprove evolution, since it's identical to modern humans, or it's actually young and therefore proof that their dating methods are wrong, and would also prove that it's not a candidate for an ancient evolutionary ancestor, as was claimed. Well, Calaveras man is ultimately irrelevant now because it was determined to be a hoax as well. It had been planted by local miners in this mine for Whitney to find. They didn't like Whitney, and they wanted him to find this and make a fool out of himself over it. So not good for evolutionists. Now, keep in mind that many evolutionists themselves are acknowledging these blunders and hoaxes, just like I was highlighting in the Wood in a Lutku quote. I'm not making this up. Here's how Michael Shermer put it: hoaxes like Piltdown Man and honest mistakes like Nebraska Man, Calaveras Man, Hesperopithecus are in time exposed. In fact, it was not creationists who exposed these errors. It was scientists who did so. Anybody see why that would annoy me? You'll catch that? Okay, so first of all, he's acknowledging creationists we're not the ones who brought this up. This is them acknowledging their own errors. But number two, they're saying creationists aren't scientists, right? It wasn't creationists, it was scientists who did. Creationists aren't, you can't be good, you're not really scientists. You know, even though the founding men of virtually every scientific discipline were creationists, you know, but they can't be scientists, even though the work of modern scientists is based on their work. I mean, come on, that's silliness. Well, bottom line is these blunders, we're not making these up. They themselves admit these problems. And yet they're not willing to change their practices that lead to these mistakes. Do you think that if you're a naturalistic evolutionist, you're going to be more likely to be morally and ethically sound? Right? You see what I'm saying? Are you more likely to be honest if you're a naturalistic evolutionist? And I would say, why would you be? I mean, if you believe in survival of the fittest, morality to a naturalistic evolutionist is a human construct. We make it up. So if you believe that survival of the fittest is the morally right thing to do, then it really doesn't matter what you do to be the strongest. You can lie about it or whatever, as long as it makes it where you're one of the strong that can survive. You would have no problems lying if it makes you stronger, right? So you're way more likely. By the way, I wrote an article in the last couple of years on a crisis. I'm going down a rabbit hole here, but this is an important rabbit hole. There's a crisis going on in the scientific community because of, they're calling the reproducibility crisis, okay? So in science, one of the checks and balances we have to make sure that something is a legitimate find, you know, a discovery or something, research that's being done, experiments you're doing. One of the checks and balances we have is another lab should be able to follow the exact same procedure the other lab did and get the exact same result if the first lab actually did an experiment that was legitimate, right? So that's called reproducibility. So you're supposed to be able to reproduce each other's experiments if it's legitimate. So if somebody else comes and tries to reproduce the experiment and gets different results, what does that tell you? Either the first lab did something wrong, or the second lab did something wrong, or they both did, right? Well, they're acknowledging in the scientific community today that there's a reproducibility crisis going on, where possibly as much as 50% of the research that is being published is not reproducible. And this is in medical science. It's really bad in the psychological sciences, right? And across the board, paleontology as well. Now, number one, that tells you just because something comes out in a journal doesn't make it legitimate. You know, and even though everybody will take it, you know, people view journals as basically the Bible of naturalistic evolution, and it's treated that way. But when you step back and think about it, it makes sense. This is something we would predict to happen among naturalistic evolutionists, because they're, by definition, they don't believe in anything, they don't believe in a God, so they can't believe in objective morality, which is what gives us a checks and balance on ourselves, because we know if we don't behave morally, there's a judgment day coming. Well, imagine eliminating that from your mind. What would keep you from lying about things if it can make you more money? If you can get away with it. Now, if you can't get away with it, well, there's social pressures. The law might get you about something. But if you can get away with it, you have no reason not to do that, other than just, what, feeling good about yourself? If you're, you know, why would you if you don't believe in morality as being objective? So we would expect this very thing to happen, that the scientific community in America is going to continue to plummet back towards the way science used to be done, where it basically becomes kind of witch doctors that just tell everybody, oh, you know, whenever I cast the bones here, this is what it means, just trust us. Oh, the way these bones here match, that means that you're going to have a man in red tomorrow. You know, I mean, that's where we're moving. We're going back to this kind of superstitious stuff, because these guys don't have ethics anymore that you can count on in the things that they are publishing. Now, this is not to say all of them by any means, but that's where we're moving, right? This is what we would expect to see in the scientific community. Now, creationists, by the way, we have our own literature that's peer-reviewed. That's a different story. I mean, we've got our peer-reviewed journals too, but I'm talking about the secular community's peer-reviewed papers. All right, little rabbit hole there, but now, Calaveras man, just because it's wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to continue to see it used as proof of evolution, because sometimes people haven't done their homework or they've ignored it and just put in there what they want. Because remember, again, naturalistic evolutionists would have no reason not to lie to you if they can get away with it, right? So any of them that are holding to a morality as though it's objective, they're not being consistent with their position, right? They may behave morally, but that's not consistent with their position to do that. You follow what I'm saying with that? So bottom line, many fossil evidences used for evolution in time are found to be erroneous. But there's a third category, irrelevant evidence. Someone says, well, what about all the hominid species that have been discovered that evolutionists still point to as evidence of evolution? The evolutionary model predicts all species descended from common ancestors, leading all the way back to the original single-celled organisms that emerged on the earth. Humans and apes descended from common ancestors, they say. And so Darwin sketched the evolutionary tree of life to illustrate this idea. And the idea was that there was a creature, for example, at the bottom there that has offspring, some of which turned into apes on one branch and some diverged and led to humans on the other. So what does the human branch look like according to evolutionists? Well, if you were to open a biology textbook and turn to the section on mammals and specifically primate evolution, you'd probably see a chart with these guys on there. It might even look something like this. The idea being to help you see what evolutionists believe to be the family tree of humans back to some ape-like ancestor. So each one of these red boxes represents a time period where they think this particular species existed. So in other words, they found fossils in the strata, the rock strata, that they think correlate to this time period. So this guy, they found fossil evidence of the guy here and maybe even only here. And so they say, okay, well, he just lived in that period. Now, it's possible that this guy lived the whole time, but that's just where they found the fossils anyway. Right? So all these different species, so this is, the A stands for Australopithecus. Australopithecus ramidus, Anamensis afarensis, Kenyanthropus platyops, Australopithecus africanus, robustus, and the H's are for Homo, Homo erectus, Homo rudolfensis, Homo sapiens, Homo habilis, Homo ergaster. All right, so you see all these guys here. Now, some have started, and I'll talk about this in a moment, this is all on a single timeline. This would be a way of saying, well, Homo sapiens evolved from Homo erectus, which evolved from these guys, Australopithecus, all the way back. But now evolutionists are changing this where it's no longer a single line. They're starting to draw it like a bush. And this is significant because what they're doing is they're pulling out the Australopithecine group. And they're recognizing, oh, wait a minute, I don't think these guys really are our ancestors. They're more like our cousins. So we need to push them over here on their own branch. So we're still related to them, but we didn't evolve from them. Now notice what that does, though. It creates a huge gap, right? Already there was a gap between the Australopithecines and the Homo group, but now they've taken the Australopithecines out, and there's even bigger gap. Because at least they're being honest enough to say, wait a minute, Australopithecines are not in our lineage. Let me talk to you for a moment about the Australopithecines. As young people, you'll hear that name. In the layers, I talked to you about briefly about the geologic column. Now at the very bottom, you have the Precambrian strata, and then you have the Paleozoic, and then the Mesozoic, and then the Cenozoic. So 4 big groups of strata. Paleozoic and Mesozoic seems to be the progression of the flood. The Cenozoic is where you have, this is what we interpret as post-flood. Right at the beginning of the Cenozoic, you start having this group of guys that are called Australopithecines that explode onto the scene. And they're different than modern apes because modern apes go around kind of hunched over. And in our skull, we have at the bottom of the skull a big hole. And that's what it's called in Latin, the big hole, foramen magnum. And it's right on the bottom because we stand upright. We're bipedal. But the chimps, that hole is further back because they're more hunched over. The Australopithecines, though, the hole is on the bottom. And yet they seem very ape-like, even though the hole's on the bottom. Which suggests that there were bipedal apes walking around after the flood. So the evolutionists have long said, well, wait a minute. Well, these may be our ancestors because they're walking around bipedal. They're, like we are. That was one of the biggest arguments they used for them being our ancestors because they're found just under where the humans, the Homo group, explodes onto the scene, and they're bipedal. And so they thought, oh, maybe this is what we evolved from. Okay, and essentially, again, they were what seems to be a group of bipedal apes. I would suggest to you, I wonder if that's where the Bigfoot legends came from. I've wondered that because there's a group of them that are really big. Australopithecus robustus and boisei are these big ones. They're big bipedal ape guys going around. So anyway, the evolutionists thought, oh, well, this must be the missing link. All right, these are the missing links between us and the ape-like creature. Well, again, that's not what they're doing now. They now have studied these enough to where they've taken that whole group and bumped it out of our ancestry and put it over at the side. That's huge. So notice, for example, what Ashley Montague said. The skull form of all Australopithecines shows too many specialized and ape-like characters to be either the direct ancestor of man or of the line that led to man. Based largely on the nature of another species, Auroran tugenensis. These paleontologists also believe that all the Australopithecines should be put into a separate branch, it's a dead-end branch that leads off to Auroran tugenensis, the Australopithecines, not to us. In fact, today this now is being acknowledged enough that the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., I went and looked at this a couple years ago, they now have taken the Australopithecines again and put them over on their, notice by the way, this is an actual from their website. And here's our family tree, the human family tree. Australopithecines used to be in the line to the Homo group. They've now taken them and put them over here on their own side branch, not our ancestors, right? That's huge for them to do that. So they're now acknowledging, okay, these guys are not in our tree. So that just opens up this massive gap. So it's even worse for evolutionists than Darwin originally thought. Now, one other thing about this, keep in mind that even if all of these species were on the evolutionary line to humans, it still wouldn't really help the evolutionist case, and here's why. Each one of these boxes is supposed to be representing a particular species with its own particular traits. Traits that make it distinctly different from other species. These aren't just little differences. They're distinct enough to make them think, okay, we're going to have to call this something different. Which, by the way, we would predict to be the case from a creation perspective, not an evolutionary perspective. It should be very gradations, very gradual. It'd be really hard to make distinctions if evolution is true. But in between each of these distinct species, there should be thousands of other species with minute changes that link each of those species. Those species would have been transitional characteristics somewhere between these other existing species. All right, question, where are they? Where's all those species? That's a lot of missing species. And remember, there should be billions of transitional fossils, representatives of each of these missing species, as well as representatives of all other species on the planet. And yet they're not there. That's not what we have. What we have is a handful of fossils from individual distinct species that are already fully formed traits as though they were created and planted on the earth already in their fully formed state, which is exactly what the creation model would predict. Let me go down another little rabbit hole quickly here. From a paleontology perspective, thinking about the fossil record, this whole transitional form idea. Vertebrate fossils make up about 0.001% of the fossil record. Did you know that? So creatures with a backbone are very rare in the fossil record. You know what most of the fossil record is? It's invertebrates. It's the shelled creatures that don't have a backbone. Why would that be? Well, because shelled creatures are going to fossilize easier. They're hard, so they're resistant to deterioration, so they stick around long enough to fossilize. So if evolution is true, what do you think should document more easily evolution happening in the fossil record? Shelled creatures. That's what you'd expect the invertebrates, because they fossilize easier. There shouldn't be gaps. Like, we should be able to see the transitions of the invertebrates throughout history. Guess how many missing link invertebrate fossils there are that are claimed to be missing links? I know of none. Nobody's even bringing that up. Kurt Wise, who's the Harvard paleontologist that I've studied with, he is an invertebrate paleontologist, and he says he knows of none that have been brought up. And yet, if evolution were true, that is the place you would find the evidence for it. That the fossil record, to all intents and purposes, is the invertebrates, and there is not one invertebrate missing link that's brought up.
What percentage are shelled creatures in the fossil record?
Yeah, well, it'd be however many of the invertebrates are shelled creatures, which I don't know what percentage that is. I mean, the number of shelled creatures is enormous, especially in the flood. It is a huge number, billions upon billions. All right, so remember I said the fossil record, I gave you this quote from Mark Ridley some time ago. There's no evidence of gradual Darwinian evolution, so maybe it doesn't happen gradually. Maybe it happens in spurts. Interpunctuated equilibrium. Again, give it a name that nobody knows what it means, and therefore it must be true. So Ridley mentions punctuationists, and I mentioned to you Stephen Jay Gould, how he spent his life trying to figure out how are we going to explain, how are we going to make the fossil record fit the evolutionary paradigm. He came up with punctuated equilibrium. That's the best thing that he could come up with. Instead of throwing out the theory of evolution and admitting creationism, he said punctuated equilibrium. I call it magical equilibrium because that's basically what it amounts to. According to this theory, long periods of time go by without evolutionary change. Periods of equilibrium, where it's just microevolution. But then, according to punctuated equilibrium, those periods of equilibrium are punctuated by sudden, rapid flurries of major evolutionary change that happen so fast that the fossil record can't keep up with it. It doesn't record it. You catch that? So the problem with this theory is at least threefold. Number one, the theory admits the fossil record doesn't document this supposed rapid change. In other words, the theory admits there's no fossil evidence for the rapid change actually happening, much less that it could happen biologically. We'd have no way to know how could that happen. Number two, it gives up on the fossil record as evidence for gradual Darwinian evolution, and yet that's still what everybody thinks out there. So if somebody buys into punctuated equilibrium, he's basically saying, creationists are right, Darwinian evolution is false. So we got to change it up. So punctuated equilibrium is not Darwinian evolution. It's more of a magical evolution. And number three, it concedes we've been right all along. Darwinian evolution is false. The geologic record supports what creationists have always conceded. Creatures appear in the fossil record and then remain the same without evolving. But from his perspective, That is the only way to make evolution harmonize with the fossil record. It's got to be that it happened so fast that there's no evidence of it in the fossil record. Okay, so it's a pure blind faith once again. There's no evidence that that can happen. There's no known biological way to make that happen. Creationists could explain that better, but not evolutionists. So what's going on here with these fossils and blunders? What's going on in the hearts of these guys? I don't think that a lot of these guys are just intentionally lying. I don't think that's going on. I think that they really want evolution to be true, and that makes them have that confirmation bias. I think that's a real thing. But there's other things going on too, because they get famous when they find something. They become the thing for a while, and they get money out of that. Michael Shermer, who I've quoted from already a few times, he said, if you want to get your fossil find published in Science or Nature, where you become somebody in science, and you want the cover illustration, you cannot conclude that your fossil is yet another Australopithecus africanus, for example. You'd better come up with an interpretation indicating that this new find you're revealing to the world for the first time is the most spectacular discovery of the last century, and that it promises to overturn hominid phylogeny and send everyone back to the drawing board to reconfigure the human evolutionary tree. Training a more skeptical eye on these fossils, however, shows that many of them belong in already well-established categories. Name diversity doesn't equal biological diversity. All right, so he's getting at motivations here. They've got motivations to become somebody, because then they can write books and make money off of it. They're more likely to get published. There's things they get out of this. But by the time people realize the error in these finds, it's already been spread far and wide and assumed to be true. All right, now let's close our discussion of the fossil record by going back to this chart that I gave you at the beginning. And at first it looks pretty intimidating. I mean, 24 fossils in this brazen, arrogant statement, we have the fossils, we win. So the evolutionists that make this chart, they intend for these fossils to stand as the evidence for the evolution of humans from an ape-like ancestor. I just want to say that I'm impressed with these young people staying with me through all this. It's a lot of information. I'm not seeing you guys napping or anything. It's pretty impressive. Y'all need to come do Flooded. It's good. Now, when you look a little closer, the first thing you notice is that this actually isn't 24 fossils. It's 12 fossils, because frontal and profile shots of each fossil are given, one above the other. Second, you see from their own documentation, if you look a little bit deeper, that they placed a modern chimp and a modern Homo sapiens at the beginning and end of this lineup, serving as kind of a starting and ending point. So an admittedly modern chimp and a modern man, these aren't proof of evolution, so you can mark them off. So you're really talking about 10 fossils that, according to this chart, are supposed to be the proof that we've evolved. All right, the next two fossils are designated by evolutionists as Australopithecus africanus. These, remember, are part of the Australopithecine group that are now being placed more and more in a side branch, not leading to humans. The next two fossils are designated by evolutionists as Homo habilis. These are believed to be the same as Australopithecus africanus and not an intermediate stage toward humans. Also, there's evidence that Australopithecus africanus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and Homo sapiens all were living contemporaneously, which doesn't fit the evolutionary model, which would say evolution should happen and then an extinction of the less fit species. Otherwise, why would the evolution happen? So Homo habilis is not a missing link. The next fossil is of Homo ergaster, which the evolutionists, including the ones that put this very chart together, consider to be morphologically the same as Homo erectus, which is morphologically the same as Homo sapiens. So no proof of human evolution here. The next fossil is Homo heidelbergensis. Remember, this was the big jaw. Morphologically the same as Homo sapiens, just bigger in the case of in the case of Heidelberg man. So again, this is not evidence of evolution either. The next three are Homo neanderthalensis, so Neanderthal man. Originally, the original guy they found ended up being merely of an old man with arthritis, and just understood to be, okay, this is just modern man. But Homo sapiens has been found, which date to much older than the Neanderthals. Remember, the Neanderthals should have long been extinct if they're a missing link. And remember, we also have evidence of humans and Neanderthals mating. There's Neanderthal DNA and modern DNA in some people. In actuality, Neanderthal man's just a modern man, not a transitional creature. And then finally, you have Cro-Magnon man, which remember is morphologically and now we know even genetically the same as modern man. So no missing link here either. So the fossil evidence for the evolution of man from an ape-like creature, it's just not there. All right, so tomorrow we're going to look at the last two planks of this evolutionary idea. Thinking about kids and the things that they need to memorize in preparation for evangelism. I've been writing songs for a long time now. I've got dozens and dozens of songs on memory verses and concepts that I put to song to make it easier for kids to memorize these. So that's what these 5 are. Be aware that we have tons of videos, short and long videos available on our website. If you haven't signed up for our email newsletter, be sure to do that, which is a free email newsletter that you can get every year or every week that highlights for you the latest articles that we're writing as well as the latest products we have. So be sure to check that out. So on our website, you can sign up for our email newsletter. Notice here, like under videos, we've got video series. You can browse the videos in general, but tons of really interesting video series. Again, some of them short, some of them long, just pages and pages of these.
They're also on YouTube.
Yes, we have a YouTube channel as well. Most of our stuff is on wvbs.org, World Video Bible School, because a lot of our video stuff we actually go and record over there. But not all of it. I actually recorded the flooded videos. At AP. All right. So again, tomorrow we're going to look at the last two planks on the chart. So we've definitely plowed through the human and ape ancestor, common ancestor idea, and dealt with that as well. But tomorrow we want to look at uniformitarianism and the geology idea there. This is fundamental doctrine of geologic evolution. So we're going to look at that and the idea, the evidence they give for an old Earth. Now, I've got an entire seminar that's just on this question too, and that is, how can you know that the actual age of the Earth? Is the age of the Earth really old? Where I go more into a lot of the dating methods that the evolutionists use to try to promote an old Earth. This will be a very succinct examination of that topic tomorrow morning. In 45 minutes, we'll plow through that and get both of these in that session before we then turn to really the bigger question, the most important question is, and that is, what is really going on here with people that refuse to see the evidence we've looked at this weekend? To give us the right perspective as Christians about this, to understand what's going on, because that can help us in interacting with these people in the coming years. I very much appreciate your attention today. What was that, 4 sessions? By the way, somebody had wanted me to, I forgot, somebody had a question about.
Just what is
The Cambrian explosion. You're going to love this. It's awesome. Let me show you a chart here. All right, here we go. What? There we go. Okay. So this is a map of the general geologic column, the way it's set up. Down at the very bottom, you have the Precambrian. There's basically no life there. It's debatable what's down there. And then you have the beginning of the Paleozoic, that's these pink layers, and then the Mesozoic and Cenozoic. So those are your four big groups, and within those, it breaks it up into more. They think, you know, the evolutionary community would say, okay, these are long periods of time. So they would say from today down to 66 million years ago, they would say is the end of the Cenozoic. And then they would go down another roughly 200 million years to this point at the bottom of the Mesozoic. And then down to 541 million years for the end of the Paleozoic. And then it goes deep into the earth. So this point right here, notice the Cambrian strata is what begins the Paleozoic. This is where the Cambrian explosion occurs. And right below it, there's this erosion surface that we call the Great Unconformity, that we get to see if you go to Grand Canyon with me on the flood experience, or the teens get to go there if they do the course and get to study this more. But there's an erosion surface that goes across the whole planet where something happened globally. It involved a lot of water, and it eroded the entire surface of the earth. In fact, eroded so much of the earth that there is over 1 billion years of radiometric time that are missing there. Like if you were to date the rocks using evolutionary dating methods, which we'll look at tomorrow, they get down to about 541 million years, and then all of a sudden you jump across that line, and all of a sudden the rocks are dating to 1.5 billion years. Something happens that shaves off the top of the earth. It involves water, and it's global. And then all of a sudden, whatever it is starts dumping creatures across the planet in water sediment, sedimentary rock. Starting with ocean floor creatures. That is your Cambrian explosion. And these creatures, again, are diverse. Some of them are simple, some of them are complex, totally different body types, and there's no evidence that they evolved from anything underneath it. They just have to surmise, well, they must have evolved in this missing billion years. You know, we don't really know, but that really what they have, evidence-wise, is these creatures just show up. And then again, as you go up through these layers, they continue to be worldwide layers throughout all of these blue and pink layers. These are what we understand to be the flood layers. And this seems to be documenting the progression of the flood, ending with the dinosaurs up here. And then the flood ends, and there's some debate among creationists about where the flood ends, but most creation geologists and paleontologists put it at the end of the Mesozoic. And then after that, you begin with what goes on after that, including the dispersion and so forth. I won't go into that because it's part of that other seminar. You guys would love this. It's the stuff I really love to present, is that other seminar. All right, so your question was, where's the Cambrian explosion? There it is. There's your answer. All right. All that happened 4 billion years, 1 billion years, or whatever. Okay, so what? 6,000 years old. Right, so they interpret it, this is their timeline. Over here I show how we interpret it. What we would say is all of this was deposited in 1 year. This is during the flood. So from this down, the billion years of radiometric time that are missing is basically probably the end of creation week and then the 1,600 years between creation and the flood. When the flood begins, it destroys the surface of the pre-flood world. And that's missing. So when you jump down here, you're into creation week rock. We're talking, this is when God causes the dry land to appear. That's it. And you get to see it at Grand Canyon. You see this place, and you see the material underneath, and then you get to see all the way up to about here in the geologic column. And we actually hike down into some of this from the surface, where you get to see some of the strata and some of the fossils that have been deposited in the flood. There's a lot more we could say about this that's very interesting, but that's not the point of this seminar. So, yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, right. Well, Yeah, like a Coconino sandstone at Grand Canyon is a huge amount of sand from the flood that's in the strata there. Okay. Young people, do you all have any questions about any of this evolutionary stuff before we call it a day? I want you all to feel free to contact me anytime you have questions about this stuff. Don't ever feel like oh, I've got some question, I don't know how to deal with this, and don't let your faith be shaken by that. Just contact me if you got questions. You contact me by email. Let's talk to your parents about how to do that. Jeff@apologeticspress.org. That's my email. Email me and remind me who you are and where I would have met you, and whenever I know, especially that you're a young person, that usually goes to the top of my email pile. And I try to get to that quicker so that I can help you and not let things shake you up. There's going to be stuff that they're going to bring up and you're not going to know what the answer is to it. Don't let that shake you up. Look, I've given you sufficient evidence here to know. There's nothing that they say that should shake your faith in the truth on this. But there's going to be things you go, I don't know how to deal with that. It's just an interesting thing. Just contact us and we'll look at it. If I don't know the answer, I'll either contact somebody that does or I'll go study it and figure it out. That's what we do at AP. That's why we exist. So don't be intimidated. Contact me. Any questions you might have, don't feel like you're stupid about that. I had lots of questions when I was your age that I needed answers to that bothered me until I found the answers to them. All right. That's all I have. I'll turn it over to you, Robert.
Second, will you lead us in closing prayer, Adam? Will you lead us in closing prayer? Second. Thank you again for being here. Certainly appreciate your time for today. Jeff, we appreciate you, all that you've done the last couple of days. Look forward to tomorrow during our Bible class and our worship service. Hope that you'll be here. If you are going to be here, I hope all of you will be here, 9:30. And then also, if you have the outline, keep the outline because the last two sessions are actually included in that one. I'll make some more up for those that are coming tomorrow, but if you have one of those outlines, keep it for tomorrow, and you can use that tomorrow. I believe that is all I have. I will ask Adam to lead us in a closing prayer, and we'll be dismissed for the evening.
Let's pray. Father God in heaven, we thank you so much for this time that you've allowed us to be together here and discuss these topics that are so relevant to our modern world that we live in, Lord. Father, thank you for Jeff that he came here and spoke to us, and please bless all the work that he's going to do now, tomorrow, and in the future. Father, we also pray that you be with the young people here that are going to face these issues, that maybe issues that we've, the older ones here, maybe outgrown and won't be so subjected to in our lifetimes. But Lord, please be with them. Guard their hearts and their minds, give them strength, and give them the confidence of your word that they can withstand any of the arrows that are going to come at them. Father, please bless us as we leave this place today and bring us back tomorrow. Father, go with us all the days of our lives. Please forgive us when we fail you. And thank you most of all for your Son, Jesus Christ, who came to this earth and died on the cross for our sins. We pray this prayer and all our prayers in his holy name. Amen.